Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time. Not just to any old place, but to ancient Greece. But forget the pristine white marble statues and the Stoic philosophers you see in textbooks. We're going to the real ancient Greece. The one that's a bit messy, a bit sticky, and frankly, a place where, if you were suddenly dropped in, your modern sensibilities might not survive the first day. We're going to pull back the toga, so to speak, and take a look at what love, relationships, and, well, everything else was really like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support helps me keep these late-night history sessions going. And while you're here at it, drop a comment below with your city and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating for me to see where everyone is tuning in from as the world spins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing on a dusty path somewhere in Attica, the scent of olive groves and dry earth in the air. The sun is warm on your skin. To understand the world you've just stepped into, we can't start with the humans. No, that would be too logical. We have to start at the top. On a cloud-shrouded mountain you can't quite see from here Olympus. Because the raw models for all human behavior there are chaotic, dysfunctional, and frankly, hilarious family of gods. You look up at the sky, and you know that somewhere up there, Zeus is probably in the middle of another terrible decision. In our world, we think of gods as paragons of virtue. But for you, here in ancient Greece, the gods are more like a cosmic reality TV show. Zeus, the king of them all, the god of sky and thunder, is also the undisputed champion of extramarital affairs. He is the patriarch who sets the tone, and that tone is complicated. His list of romantic conquests is so long it could fill a scroll from Athens to Sparta, and his methods, let's just say they lack subtlety. He famously turned himself into a swan to get close to Leda, a bull to abduct Europa, and even a shower of gold too. Well, you get the picture. It's less about romance and more about a divine being doing whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And his wife, Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, spends most of her divine energy not on blissful partnership, but on tracking Zeus's affairs and creatively punishing his unfortunate lovers and their offspring. Her fury is the stuff of legend. She's the patron goddess of marriage, yet her own marriage is a blueprint for jealousy and revenge. It's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it? And it's not just the royal couple. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, is married to the hard-working, gritty-headed Zeus, the god of the forge. You'd think that would be a nice parent, but she's perpetually entangled in a passionate, very public affair with Oz, the brutish god of war. There's a famous story where Hephaestus, tired of being the butt of the joke, forges an unbreakable, invisible net. He sets it up over their bed, and the next time Aphrodite and Oz meet, he springs the trap. He then invites all the other gods to come and laugh at the entangled, naked couple. That's not a private spat, that's divine-level public shaming. And yet, it changes nothing. The affair continues. This is the divine soap opera that forms the backdrop of your entire belief system. These stories aren't just silly myths you tell children. They are your religion. They explain the world. A sudden storm, Zeus is probably angry. An earthquake, Poseidon is having a bad day. These tales are painted on your pottery, sung by poets at festivals, and performed in grand theatres. Here's a little detail you might not think about: these divine alliances were often used by prominent families to claim a heroic or even divine lineage. If your great-great-great-grandfather was, say, the hero Heracles, that meant your family line traces directly back to Zeus himself. It's the ultimate status symbol, a divine drop of blood in your ancestry. So in a strange way, Zeus's inability to keep it in his pants is the foundation for the aristocracy. It's a very practical application of divine scandal. But here's the big question. And it's something historians and classicists still argue about to this day. Did the average Greek person, someone like you, actually look at the gods' behavior as a green light for their own actions? Or did they see it more as a cautionary tale when you hear the story of Zeus and Hera? Do you think, well, if the king of the gods can have a side piece, so can I? Or do you think, well, even the gods are a mess, so maybe I should try to be better? The answer is likely somewhere in the middle. The gods were meant to be moral exemplars. They were Persephone's gains of nature and human nature in all its powerful, beautiful, and deeply flawed glory. They represented the idea that desire, power, and jealousy are forces as fundamental as the lightning in the sky. They didn't provide a moral compass so much as a map of the chaotic human heart. So as you stand on that dusty road, the stories of the gods aren't distant fairy tales. They are in the air you breathe, a constant reminder that the universe is run by beings with immense power but very, very relatable impulses. And this divine chaos is the soil in which all the human rules about love, marriage, and desire will grow. All right, let's leave the gods to their squabbles on Olympus and walk into town. As you meander through the narrow, winding streets of Athens, you notice the houses are surprisingly plain. Most are built from sun-dried mud brick, huddled together, presenting unassuming, windowless facades to the public street. There's no manicured front lawn, no welcoming porch. They seem closed off, secretive. But behind one of these plain walls is the entire universe of your social and personal life. Welcome to the oikos. Now, when you hear oikos, you might think house. And you're not wrong. But you're not entirely right either. An oikos is so much more than just the physical structure. It is the fundamental cell of Greek society. It's the building. Yes, but it's also the family living within it. The land it owns. The slaves. The livestock. The stored grain. The olive oil. The wine, everything. It's a self-contained economic and social unit. And its prime directive, its entire reason for being, is not happiness, love, or personal fulfillment. Its purpose is survival, self-sufficiency, and, above all, the production of a legitimate male heir to inherit it all and carry on the family line. Think of it less like a cozy home and more like a small, family-run corporation whose main product is a son. As the male head of the household, you are the Kyrios, the lord and master. The weight of the entire oikos rests on your shoulders. You manage the farm. You sell the surplus olive oil. You represent the family's interests in the assembly and the law courts. Your world is the polis, the city-state. Your life is public, facing outward. But step inside your own front door, and the world immediately bifurcates. Most respectable Athenian homes are designed with a very specific social code in mind. Near the entrance, you have the andron, the men's quarters. This is your domain. It's the most decorated room in the house, with cushioned couches lining the walls, maybe a mosaic on the floor. This is where you receive your male friends, your business associates, your political allies. It's a semi-public space within the private home. The air here smells of watered-down wine, olive oil from the lamps, and the lingering scent of yesterday's philosophical debate. Now, go deeper into the house, past the central courtyard, often in the most secluded part of the building, sometimes even on a second floor. You find the Gyneceum, the women's quarters. This is your wife's world. It is private, hidden, and intentionally cut off from the public male world of the andron. If the andron is the public face of the oikos, the Gyneceum is its closely guarded heart. Here, the sounds are different. Instead of boisterous debate, you hear the rhythmic clatter of the loom, the quiet chatter of female slaves, and the murmur of children. This is the control center for the household's internal operations. Your wife, the Tyria, is the manager of this domain. You married her not out of a whirlwind romance, but through a negotiation between your father and hers. A dowry was paid. A contract was made. Her primary duties are to manage the household stores, a critical job, as she holds the keys to the family's food supply, to oversee the slaves, to produce textiles, a valuable commodity, and, her most vital function, to bear and raise your legitimate children. She is less your romantic partner and more your chief operating officer. The philosopher Xenophon literally wrote a manual on this, suggesting the ideal wife is like a queen bee, directing the work of the household from its center, ensuring everything runs smoothly and efficiently. Here's a small but telling detail. A respectable wife's virtue was so closely tied to her seclusion that the idea was for her name never to be mentioned in public by men outside her family. To be spoken of, for good or for ill, was a mark of shame. Her identity was entirely subsumed by the oikos. She was not Aspasia. She was the wife of Pericles. But this leads us to a major point of debate among classicists. Was your wife really a prisoner in her own home where the walls of the Guinea CE truly a domestic prison? The literary and legal texts, all written by men from the upper crust of Athenian society, certainly paint a picture of extreme seclusion. They suggest that a good woman's world was bounded by the four walls of her home, and that for her to be seen wandering the streets alone was a sign of poor character or dire poverty. However, many historians now argue this is an incomplete, idealized, and rather snobbish view. For one, this model only works for families wealthy enough to have a large house with separate quarters and enough slaves to do the shopping. What about the other 90% of the population if you were a poor farmer? Your wife was out in the fields working alongside you. If you were a craftsman, she might be helping run the shop. These women simply couldn't afford the luxury of seclusion. Furthermore, there was one universally acceptable reason for women to leave the house: religion. Major public festivals, like the Ponadonea or the Symposium or women-only festival, were not just a right but a duty. On these days, the streets of Athens would be filled with women, socializing, participating in processions, and for a brief time, inhabiting the public space that was usually denied to them. So the reality of female seclusion is a complex picture that likely varied hugely by class and location. It's a question that scholars are still wrestling with, trying to piece together the silent majority's experience from the loud minority's texts. So as you stand in your courtyard, the sun filtering down, you are the bridge between these two worlds, the outer world of the polis and the inner world of the oikos. Your relationship with your wife is one of partnership and duty, built on a foundation of economic necessity. Affection could certainly grow over time, like a vine on a sturdy wall, but passion and romance that wasn't part of the contract. The oikos was for procreation, not passion, and this very fact meant that a Greek man, someone like you, would have to look for that elsewhere. Let's zoom in on you now. Not just any you, but a specific, privileged you. You are an Athenian citizen. This isn't just a statement of residency, it's a title, a badge of honor that grants you a whole suite of legal rights and social expectations. To be a citizen, you must be male, of a certain age, usually 18 to begin, but full political power comes later, and, crucially, born of two parents who were themselves children of Athenian citizens. This last part is a big deal, a rule solidified in the mid-5th century BC under Pericles, making citizenship a rather exclusive club. Your life is structured around this identity. Every morning, you might walk to the PENYX, the hill where the assembly meets, to cast your vote on matters of war, peace, and public policy, or you might be called to serve on a massive jury not of 12, but of hundreds, even thousands, of your fellow citizens to hear a case in the law courts. You are expected to have an opinion and to participate. The philosopher Aristotle famously said that a man who takes no interest in politics is not a man who minds his own business, he is a man who has no business here at all. The polis is your project, and you are its co-owner. This public responsibility extends to your body. As a citizen, you're also a soldier. From a young age, you've spent countless hours in the gymnasium, exercising naked with your peers, It's not about getting a beach body, it's about preparing for the brutal reality of hoplite warfare. A strong, disciplined body is a service to the state. Your physical fitness is a civic duty. Because society places all these responsibilities on your shoulders: political, judicial, military. It also grants you an extraordinary amount of freedom in your personal life. The law and social custom are designed, first and foremost, to protect your interests and the integrity of your oikos. The rules that apply to you are fundamentally different from those that apply to everyone else: women, slaves, foreigners, metics, and children. Let's talk about what this means for your private life. The primary concern of the law is the production of a legitimate heir. Therefore, the one absolute, non-negotiable sexual law for you is that you must not commit adultery with the wife of another Athenian citizen. Notice the specific wording. The crime, moikiii, is not about cheating in the modern sense. It's about violating another man's oikos. You are trespassing on his property and, most critically, creating a risk of introducing a non-legitimate heir into his bloodline. This was a crime so severe it could, in some cases, be legally punished by death on the spot if the husband caught you in the act. The sanctity of the citizen bloodline was everything. But outside of that one major prohibition, your world is remarkably permissive, as long as you adhere to certain unwritten rules. Your sexual life is not viewed through a simple moral lens of right and wrong so much as a social one of dominant and submissive. As a free, adult, male citizen, you are expected always to be the dominant, active partner in any sexual encounter. The crucial factor was not the gender of your partner, but your role in the act. So you could have relations with slaves, male or female, foreigners, or professional sex workers with almost no social stigma attached. These individuals were outside the protected class of citizen families, and your relationship with them did not threaten the all-important inheritance line. In these encounters, you were the dominant party, the one who desires and takes. This was seen as natural, an expression of a healthy masculine libido. A man with a strong sex drive was seen as vigorous and manly, not debauched. Here's a quirky little detail that illustrates this: the legal status of brothels. Not only were they legal in Athens, but they were state-regulated and taxed. There's a famous story, though its historical accuracy is debated, that the great statesman Solon actually established the first state-funded brothels using the revenue from their taxes. The idea was to provide a safe and affordable outlet for young men's desires, thereby protecting respectable citizen women from being harassed on the streets. It's a pragmatic, almost clinical, approach to civic planning that feels very alien to modern sensibilities. The city wasn't promoting virtue, it was managing a public health issue. However, there is a fierce and ongoing debate among scholars about the emotional reality behind this legal framework. Did an Athenian man like you feel a genuine emotional disconnect from his wife? As the social structure seems to suggest, was your marriage purely a dynastic and economic arrangement, with love and passion sought exclusively outside the home? Some scholars, reading the Stoic legal texts and the raunchy comedies, argue yes, they paint a picture of a society where men and women lived largely separate emotional lives. But other historians push back against this, pointing to small but significant pieces of evidence to the contrary. They look at funeral inscriptions where husbands express profound grief and deep affection for their deceased wives. They analyze passages in tragedies, like Sophocles' Antigone, where the love between a betrothed couple is central to the plot. They examine private letters on cursed tablets. These sources hint at a much more complex and varied emotional landscape, suggesting that genuine love, companionship, and even passion couldn't exist within the confines of an Athenian marriage. The truth is likely that there was no single Athenian marriage. Like today, relationships probably ran the gamut from cold and functional to deeply loving and intimate. The official rules tell one story, but human hearts have a way of ignoring the rulebook. So, as a citizen, you walk through Athens with a unique sense of ownership and freedom. You are the pillar of the state. The rules are made for you, and by you, and this privileged position shapes every aspect of your life. from how you vote in the assembly to who you are allowed to desire, and how you are allowed to act on that desire. Your identity is a passport to a world of freedoms denied to more than half the people you see around you. Let's step out of the sunlit, bustling world of the polis and into the shadows of the oikos again. This time, we're not staying in the semi-public and drawn. We're going deeper inside, to that secluded, almost hidden space we mentioned earlier, the Gymnasium, or the women's quarters. Imagine you are now an Athenian woman, the wife of the citizen we were just following. Your perspective on the world is about to change dramatically. Your world has shrunk. The vast political landscape of the city is now a distant murmur. Something you hear about from your husband or male relatives, but never witness firsthand. Your direct sphere of influence is the household, and your daily life is a routine dictated by domestic necessity and social propriety. Your primary task, the one that defines your value to the oikos, is producing a male heir, but your day-to-day existence is consumed by another monumental responsibility: weaving. The rhythmic clack-clack of the loom is the soundtrack to your life. From a young age, you and the female slaves of the household spend hours spinning wool into thread and weaving that thread into fabric. This isn't a hobby, like knitting a scarf. This is a vital economic activity. The clothes for your entire family, the blankets, the textiles that might be sold or traded, all are produced under your supervision in the Guinea Sea. It's a mark of good household management. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope's virtue is inextricably linked to her loom. Her cleverness in weaving and unweaving a burial shroud to hold off her suitors is the ultimate symbol of a faithful, intelligent wife managing her oikos in her husband's absence. Your space is populated almost exclusively by other women and young children. Your companions are your female slaves, your daughters, and perhaps your husband's mother. Male visitors are strictly forbidden, unless they are very close relatives, like your father or brother. Even the family doctor would typically have to diagnose you by speaking to your husband, relying on a second-hand description of your symptoms rather than examining you directly. Your body, like your reputation, is to be shielded from the eyes of outside men. This seclusion is framed as a matter of protection and respect. A good husband, it was said, kept his wife safe, like a precious treasure, locked away from the dangers and courses of the outside world. That it also served a very practical purpose, ensuring your fidelity and, by extension, the legitimacy of your children. Your virtues of rosy near complex term meaning moderation, self-control, and chastity is the bedrock upon which the entire patrilineal system is built. Now for a slightly bizarre, and kind of sad, little detail about your life. Because you and your husband live in such separate spheres, your wedding day was likely the first time you ever met him. Marriages were arranged, often when you were a young teenager, maybe 14 or 15, while your husband was likely much older, perhaps in his late 20s or 30s. This age gap was intentional. It reinforced the power dynamic, placing you in a subordinate, almost daughter-like role to your husband, who was expected to train you in the management of his household. The wedding ceremony itself symbolized this transition. You would be ritually abducted from your father's home and escorted in a chariot to your husband's home, signifying the transfer of authority from one kurios to another. You went from being your father's charge to your husband's. This brings us to one of the most significant and debated aspects of a woman's life in Athens, her emotional and intellectual world. Given this extreme segregation, did women have their own vibrant subculture, or were they intellectually starved and isolated? The traditional view, based on the male-authored texts, tends towards the latter. Men like the playwright Euripides wrote lines like, "A woman should be seen and not heard," reflecting a common sentiment that female intellect was either non-existent or dangerous. However, a closer look suggests some more nuanced reality. While you were denied formal education in rhetoric, philosophy, and politics, you received a different kind of education within the Guinea Sea. You learned household management, medicine, and child care. More importantly, You were the primary keepers of oral traditions, lullabies, folk tales, and the intricate details of religious rites. You would have had your own festivals, most famously the Symposium, a multi-day, women-only religious festival in honor of the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. During this festival, men were completely excluded, and women engaged in their own secret rituals, feasting and socializing, creating a powerful, temporary matriarchal space within the patriarchal city. Historians are still trying to piece together the texture of these female-only spaces. What did you talk about when no men were around? Did you complain about your husband's share gossip form deep, lasting friendships? The evidence is scarce, as women's voices were rarely written down. But some scholars argue that these segregated spheres might have inadvertently fostered incredibly strong bonds of female solidarity. They look at the plots of Greek tragedies, many of which revolve around powerful female relationships, sisters, mothers and daughters, women conspiring together like in Lysistrata. Albeit a comedy, these might be echoes of a real, vibrant female social world that existed behind the closed doors of the Gymnasium. Was it a prison, or was it a sanctuary? The answer is probably both, depending on the day, the household, and the woman herself. It was a world of constraints. But within those constraints, women carved out their own sources of power, community, and meaning, far from the gaze of the city's men. So while your husband is at the assembly, debating the fate of the nation, you are at the heart of the oikos, managing its present and weaving its future, one thread at a time. Your life may be quiet, but it is anything but simple. The sun has set over Athens. The day's business in the agora is done. The craftsmen have shuttered their shops, and a cool evening breeze is beginning to drift through the city. For you, the Athenian citizen, the day is not over. It's just entering its most enjoyable phase. You've received an invitation. Tonight, you're going to a symposium. Now, if you hear symposium and picture dry, academic conference, you need to erase that image immediately. The Greek word symposium literally means drinking together. It is a private, all-male drinking party, and it is the beating heart of Athenian social life. This is where politics are discussed, business deals are sealed, poems are recited, and philosophies are born. It is an institution as central to Athenian identity as the assembly or the theatre. You arrive at your friend's house and are ushered not into the main part of the home, but directly into the undrawn, the men's quarters we talked about. The room is already buzzing with conversation. You and the other guests, maybe a dozen or so, recline on cushioned couches, called clinae, arranged around the walls. You're not sitting upright in chairs, you're lounging, propped up on your left elbow, leaving your right hand free for eating and drinking. The posture itself encourages a relaxed, convivial atmosphere. The evening begins with a meal. Small tables are placed before each couch, laden with food, bread, cheese, olives, figs, perhaps some fish or stewed meat. You eat with your hands. But this is just the prelude. Once the food is cleared away, the symposium proper begins. A large mixing bowl, the crater, is brought into the center of the room. This is the altar of the evening. Wine is poured into it, but never, ever served neat. To drink undiluted wine is considered the mark of a barbarian. It's a sign of a lack of self-control. The wine is always mixed with water, and the ratio of wine to water is a critical decision, said by the Symposia RCH, a master of the drinking who is elected for the evening. His job is to gauge the mood of the guests and decide how strong the drinks should be, thereby directing the course of the entire night. Will it be a night of sober philosophical discussion or a rowdy, drunken revel? The fate of the evening is in his hands. Libations are poured, a splash of wine offered to the gods, particularly Dionysus, the god of wine, theatre, and ecstasy. Then the drinking begins. A shared cup is passed from guest to guest, each man drinking in turn. As the wine flows, so does the entertainment. And this is where the symposium becomes more than just a party. There might be a poet who recites his latest work, A flute girl or a player might be hired to provide music. Guests might be challenged to impromptu contests capping each other's verses, solving riddles, or playing party games. One of the most famous symposium games was called a boss. This is a fantastically specific and slightly ridiculous little custom. After draining your wine cup, you would hold it by the handle, and with a flick of your wrist, fling the last dregs of wine across the room, aiming to hit a specific target, often a small disc balanced atop a metal stand. The goal was to knock the disc off with a satisfying clang. It was a game of skill, and bets were often made. It was said that a young man in love would often dedicate his throw to his beloved. A successful shot was a good omen for his romantic pursuits. It's a wonderfully human detail amidst all the high-minded philosophy. They're still flicking sticky wind rags at a target for fun. But of course, the Symposium is most famous for its conversation. This is the setting for Plato's dialogues. It's here, in this wine-soaked, May-lonely environment, that Socrates would have pestered his fellow drinkers with questions about justice, virtue, and the nature of love. The Symposium was a space where men could speak freely, away from the ears of their wives and families. They could gossip, they could talk politics, and they could engage in intellectual sparring that sharpened their wits for the public debates in the assembly. Now we have to address the other figures in the room. The only women present at a symposium were not the wives of the guests. They were hired entertainers, flute girls, dancers, acrobats, and, most notably, the heteroia class of highly educated, witty, and sophisticated female companions whom we will meet in more detail later. These women were the exception to the rule of female seclusion. They could converse, joke, and flirt with the men, adding a different kind of energy to the party. Their presence underscores a key theme: the separation of spheres. The oikos was for procreation. The Symposium was for pleasure, intellectual, social, and physical. There's a constant debate among historians about the true nature of the Symposium. Was it primarily an elite, intellectual salon, as Plato's writings suggest, or was it more often a boisterous, drunken brawl, as depicted on many wine vases which show guests vomiting or engaging in rowdy behavior? The answer, as is so often the case, is that it was probably both, and everything in between. A symposium could be a refined gathering of poets one night, and a wild stag party the next. The institution was flexible. What's certain is that the symposium was a primary venue for forging the bonds between men that were so crucial to the functioning of the polis. It was a training ground for the young, a networking event for the ambitious, and a space of intellectual freedom for the curious. As you recline on your couch, the cup coming around to you again, the sound of the flute mingling with the laughter of your friends, you are at the very center of the Athenian male world, a world fueled by wine, wit, and a shared sense of belonging. Let's turn away from the wine-fueled camaraderie of the Symposium and return to the more sober reality of the oikos. We need to talk about the institution that creates that ethos in the first place: marriage. And if you're picturing a romantic ceremony with heartfelt vows and a celebration of love, you'll need to adjust your expectations. In ancient Greece, marriage was, first and foremost, a transaction. You, as a young woman of about 14 or 15, have very little say in the matter. Your marriage is arranged by your kyrios, your father or legal male guardian. He will choose a suitable husband for you, and his criteria are not romantic compatibility or your personal happiness. He is looking for a good match for the oikos. This means a man of similar or higher social standing, someone who can provide for you, and whose family is respectable. The goal is to forge a beneficial alliance between two families. The key moment in this process is the enyi, which translates roughly to betrothal or contract. This is a verbal agreement made between your father and your future husband. It's a public pledge, spoken in front of witnesses. Your father would say a phrase something like, "I give you this, my daughter, for the plowing of legitimate children." That agricultural metaphor, plowing, is stark and deliberate. It strips away any romantic pretense and states the purpose of the union in the bluntest possible terms: procreation. This isn't about love, it's about producing a crop of sons to inherit the family property. To understand you, the most important negotiation takes place: the dowry. Your father provides a dowry to your new husband. This isn't a gift. It's a crucial piece of financial security for you. The dowry remains your property legally, though your husband manages it. If he dies, or if he decides to divorce you, he or his family is legally obligated to return the dowry in full. This was a powerful disincentive for a man to casually divorce his wife. Divorcing her meant a significant financial hit. The dowry served as a kind of insurance policy, protecting you from being cast aside without resources. Now let's talk about the wedding itself, the gamos. It's less a single ceremony and more of a multi-part public performance of transferring you from one household to another. The day before, you would make sacrifices to the gods, offering up your childhood toys and a lock of your hair to goddesses like Artemis or Hera. This symbolized the end of your girlhood and your transition to the status of a wife. On the wedding day, you would have a ritual bath in water drawn from a sacred spring. You'd be dressed in a special wedding garment, often woven by your own mother, and a veil would cover your face, symbolizing your modesty and virginity. The main event is the wedding feast, held at your father's house. But here's a crucial difference: the bride, would likely eat separately from the male guests, remaining veiled. The feast is more for the men of the two families to celebrate their new alliance. The climax of the day is the procession. As evening falls, your new husband will come to your father's house. In a moment of staged ritual, he will grab you by the wrist and lead you from your home. This is a symbolic abduction, a remnant of an older tradition, signifying his claim over you. You are placed in a chariot, with your husband on one side and his best man Poro-Chos on the other, and driven through the streets to his house. A crowd of your family and friends follows, singing wedding hymns, like the Hymenaeus, to ward off evil spirits. The noise and publicity of the procession are vital. It serves as a public announcement: everyone in the community is now a witness to this new union. When you arrive at your new home, your new mother-in-law greets you at the door with torches. You are offered a quince, a type of fruit associated with fertility, to eat. Then, you are led to the bridal chamber, the Alamos. The door is closed, and a friend of the groom stands guard outside, a symbolic protector of the couple's privacy. The union is consummated, and the next morning, the proof of your virginity might be shown to female relatives. You are now officially a wife. But here is a somewhat strange and debated legal point. While the Enye and the Gamos established the marriage socially, some historians argue that the true legal marker of a marriage was the birth of the first child. It was the plowing bearing fruit that truly solidified the union in the eyes of the law and society. Until you produced a child, preferably a son, your position in your new oikos could feel precarious. Classicists still debate the emotional content of these arranged marriages. Were they on cold, loveless contracts? It's unlikely. While love wasn't the starting point, affection and a deep sense of partnership, what the Greeks called philia, could certainly develop over years of shared life and the raising of children. Xenophon, in his Oeconomicus, has an older man advise a younger one to train his young wife to be a good partner, suggesting that a good marriage required effort and education, not just a contract. He frames the ideal husband-wife relationship as a team, like two horses yoked to the same plow, working together for the good of the oikos. It's not a modern vision of romance, but it's a vision of profound, practical partnership. The home you now inhabit is not one you chose, and the man you share it with was a stranger until yesterday. But this is your life now, a life of duty, management, and the hope of building a lasting legacy for a family that is now yours. All right, let's step out of the highly structured world of marriage and into one of the most famous, and to modernize us, most perplexing aspects of Greek society. We're going to talk about the love between men. But to do that, we have to be very precise. We're not talking about a relationship between two equals, two adult men. We are entering the world of paideristia. This word, often translated as pederasty or boy love, carries a lot of negative weight today, and for good reason. But to understand it in its ancient Greek context, we have to try, just for a moment, to see it through their eyes. For the elite Athenian man, paideristia was not just a sexual practice, it was a social institution, an educational model, and an idealized form of relationship that was celebrated in poetry, philosophy, and art. Imagine you are a respected Athenian citizen in your 30 seconds. You frequent the gymnasium and the Paula S3X school, not just for your own exercise, but to watch the city's youth train. Your eyes are drawn to a particular boy, a teenager, HES perhaps between 12 and 17 years old. He is beautiful. Yes, physical beauty Kalos was seen as an outward sign of inner virtue, but he also shows promise. He is graceful, intelligent, and has a noble bearing. You see in him the potential to become a great citizen. You decide to become his Aristes, which means lover. Your role is not just about desire. You are meant to be his mentor, his guide into the adult male world. You will take him under your wing. You will introduce him to your influential friends at the Symposium. You will teach him about politics, ethics, and philosophy. You will model for him what it means to be a good, honorable man. In exchange for this mentorship, you hope to win his affection, his philia, and his admiration. The relationship is supposed to be ennobling for both parties. You, the older man, are inspired by his youthful beauty to be a better version of yourself, to be worthy of his admiration. He, the younger boy, benefits from your wisdom and experience, helping him grow into a virtuous adult. This idealized version is what Plato discusses in his dialogues. For him, the physical desire for the boy's beauty was just the first. There was strung on a ladder of love. This desire was meant to be transcended, leading the Aristes to appreciate not just the beauty of one boy, but the beauty of all things, and eventually, to contemplate the abstract, divine form of beauty itself. It's a highly intellectual and philosophical justification for the institution. The boy in this dynamic is the Eromenos, which means the beloved. His role is just as socially scripted as the Aristes. He is not supposed to be driven by lust. In fact, for him to seem too eager or to be motivated by physical pleasure would be a source of shame. His expected response is one of modesty, reserve, and a kind of grateful affection. He grants his favor not as a sexual act, but as a reward for the Aristes' guidance and honorable courtship. The ideal Eromenos is not passive, but he is also not the pursuer. He holds the power of bestowing or withholding his affection, which in turn reflects on the character of his suitor. Let's look at a small, specific custom that highlights this ideal. The courtship process was public. An Aristes would openly pursue an Eromenos. He would send him gifts, write him poems, and praise his beauty to others. A common gift was a rooster. This might seem random to us, but roosters were seen as symbols of virility, courage, and a fighting spirit. Giving a rooster as a gift was a way of saying, I admire your spirit, and I want to help you cultivate it. It was a respectable, symbolic gesture of this educative love. This entire institution was almost exclusively the domain of the free, upper classes. It took place in the spaces where these classes mingled: the gymnasium, the symposium. It was part of the fabric of aristocratic life, a way of transmitting cultural values and building social networks from one generation to the next. The relationship was seen as a vital part of a young man's education before he married and took on the responsibilities of his own ethos. Now here's where the scholarly debate gets really intense. This highly idealized, philosophical model that we've just described, was it real, or was it just a pretty story that elite men told themselves to justify what was, at its core, a system of exploitation? Some scholars argue that the philosophical justifications were a kind of propaganda for the elite. They point out the inherent power imbalance in the relationship an older, powerful citizen and a young, non-citizen boy. They argue that beneath the veneer of mentorship, the reality was often much closer to coercion or, at the very least, social pressure that a young boy could not easily resist. They suggest that the emphasis on the boy's modesty was a way to mask the fundamentally unequal nature of the exchange. On the other hand, some historians argue that we shouldn't judge the institution entirely by modern standards. They suggest that in a society where marriage was not based on romantic love, these relationships offered a space for genuine passion and deep emotional connection that was otherwise missing from a man's life. They point to the vast amount of poetry and art celebrating these bonds as evidence of sincere affection. They argue that while the potential for abuse certainly existed, the ideal of a mutually beneficial, ennobling relationship was a genuine cultural value that many tried to live up to. The truth is almost certainly messy and lies somewhere in between these two poles. The ideal of paiderastia was a beautiful and complex theory of mentorship and love, but the practice, involving real humans with all their flaws and desires, was likely far more complicated and varied than the philosophers would have us believe. So we have the ideal of paiderastia, the noble, older Aristes guiding the beautiful, young Eromenos into virtuous manhood. But like any social institution, especially one involving desire and power, it was governed by a complex and often unspoken set of rules. Stepping outside these lines could turn an acceptable social practice into a public scandal. Let's delve into the intricate etiquette of this relationship. The do's and don'ts that you, as an Athenian man, would have instinctively understood. The first and most important rule circles back to that core Greek concept of social roles. You, the adult citizen, the Aristes, must always be the active, dominant partner. You are the one who pursues, who desires, who mentors. The boy, the Eromenos, is the one who is pursued, who is desired, who is mentored. This dynamic had to be maintained visually and behaviorally. For an Aristes to be seen as taking a passive or receptive role would be a source of immense shame. It would be considered unmanly, a betrayal of his status as a citizen. The law itself reflected this. While the relationship was largely unregulated, there were laws against prostitution for male citizens. A citizen could not sell his body, because that would place him in a submissive, servile role, blurring the line between a free man and a slave. For the Eromenos, the rules were equally strict, but focused on his demeanor. He had to be modest and reserved. He could not appear to be selling his favor for gifts or money. To do so would make him a prostitute porners, a deeply dishonorable status. The gifts from the Aristes were meant to be tokens of esteem, not payment. The line was a fine one, and a boy and his family had to be very careful to ensure his reputation remained intact. He was supposed to grant his affection chorus reluctantly, as a reward for the suitor's good character and persistent, honorable courtship. He was not supposed to enjoy the physical aspect of the relationship, or at least, he was not supposed to show that he enjoyed it. To do so would suggest a womanly or submissive nature. This leads to a fascinating and very specific physical detail that art historians have pointed out. When you look at depictions of these couples on Greek vases, you often see a particular pose. The Aristes will be embracing the Eromenos, trying to caress him, while the Eromenos often looks away, sometimes even raising a hand as if to gently push the man away. This isn't necessarily depicting a rejection. It's depicting the ideal of youthful modesty. The boy is showing his virtue by not being overly eager. It is a visual representation of the proper social script. Another crucial unwritten rule was about timing and discretion. The relationship was supposed to be temporary, a specific phase in a young man's life. It was a pre-adulthood institution. It was not meant to interfere with the primary duty of a citizen, marriage and procreation. Once the Eromenos grew a full beard and became a citizen himself, the relationship was expected to end, or at least to transform into a more conventional friendship between equals. For an adult man to continue to play the role of the beloved was deeply shameful. The comedian Aristophanes, in his plays, mercilessly mocked adult men who were perceived as still being in the passive role. calling them why dost you reproach tos and other colorful insults. Here's a specific, almost legalistic, nuance that captures the Greek mindset. There was a concept known as hybris. Hybris is often translated as pride or arrogance. But it's more specific than that. It means an act of outrageous insolence, an abuse of power that intentionally shames and dishonors another person. An Aristes who forced himself upon a boy, who treated him not as a beloved mentee but as a mere object for his own gratification, could be seen as committing hybris. The crime was not the sexual act itself, but the humiliation and dishonoring of a future citizen. A famous court case against T. Marchus, delivered by the orator Aeschines, revolves entirely around this. T. Marchus is accused of having prostituted himself as a youth. His accuser argues that because he sold his body, he forfeited his rights as a citizen and should be barred from speaking in the assembly. The case demonstrates that society wasn't concerned with the morality of the homosexual act, but with whether it followed the rules of honor, status, and power that defined a citizen's life. But this rigid set of rules raises a major question that historians still grapple with: how much of this was just a performance? Were young men genuinely indifferent to the physical side of these relationships? Or were they just acting out a socially required script of modesty? The male-authored sources are clear on what should happen, but they give us very little insight into the boy's actual feelings or experience. Some scholars argue that the emphasis on the boy's reluctance was a necessary social fiction. It allowed society to compartmentalize the practice, separating it from the unmanly submission associated with women or slaves. By pretending the boy wasn't enjoying it, the relationship could be framed as purely educational and dominant-submissive, preserving the masculine honor of both parties. Others suggest that the emotional reality was far more diverse. It's plausible that some boys felt coerced, some were indifferent, and some developed genuine affection and even passion for their older mentors, but had to conceal it behind a mask of youthful modesty. The vase paintings, with their averted gazes and subtle gestures, might not just be showing a social ideal, but also hinting at the complex, unspoken emotional negotiations that were at the heart of every one of these relationships. So, while the institution of paiderastia might seem straightforward on the surface, its day-to-day practice was a delicate dance of etiquette and honor. It was a system full of potential pitfalls, where a wrong step, a breach of protocol, or a hint of the wrong kind of desire could lead to public disgrace. The relationship between the Aristes and the Eromenos was, by its very nature, temporary. It was a bridge, not a destination. It was designed to guide a boy across the threshold from youth to manhood. So what happens when the Eromenos, the beautiful, beloved boy, starts to change? What happens when his cheeks begin to sprout a beard? This was not a trivial matter. The first growth of facial hair was a clear, biological signal that boyhood was ending. In the Greek world, this physical transformation marked a crucial turning point. The Eromenos was becoming a man, and with that, the rules of the game changed completely. As the Eromenos, the moment you could grow a full beard, you were considered to have reached adulthood. You were now eligible to become a full citizen, to marry, and to start your own ecos. Continuing in the role of the beloved was no longer socially acceptable. It would be seen as a failure to mature, a refusal to step into your proper masculine role in society. The window for being an Eromenos had closed. The relationship with your Aristes had to either end or evolve. For the Aristes, continuing to pursue a boy who was now a bearded man was also seen as inappropriate, even a bit pathetic. The desire for a youth was socially sanctioned because it was tied to his potential and his burgeoning beauty. The desire for a grown man, however, didn't fit into the same neat, educational framework. It was seen as less noble, more purely carnal. There's a wonderful Greek term for this: pogonophilia, a love for beards, which was often used with a slightly mocking tone to describe men who improperly continued their pursuits past the acceptable age. The ideal conclusion to the paid-aristic relationship was a graceful transition into a lifelong friendship philia between equals. The former Aristes would now be a political ally, a trusted friend, a social peer. The bond forged in youth was meant to mature into a durable network of support in adulthood. The older man would watch with pride as his former beloved took his place in the assembly, commanded troops in battle, and raised his own legitimate sons. The educational project was complete. The student had become a master. This was the clean, honorable ending that the system was designed for. However, human emotions are rarely so neat. What if genuine love had blossomed? This is where things could get complicated. Some vase paintings and poems hint at the sorrow and awkwardness of this transition. There are depictions of the Aristes looking mournfully at the first hairs on his beloved's chin. It was the end of an era, and likely, for some, a genuine heartbreak. Here's a small detail that illustrates the cultural importance of this moment. The first beard was a cause for celebration and ritual. A young man would ceremonially shave his first facial hair and dedicate it to a god, often Apollo. This was a public declaration of his new status as an adult. It was a rite of passage, as significant as any other in his life, for his Aristes. Attending the ceremony would be a bittersweet moment, a final acknowledgement of his changing role from mentor-lover to simple friend. Of course, not all relationships ended so gracefully. The transition could be messy. The legal speech against Team Archus, which we mentioned before, is a prime example of how these relationships could sour and be used as political weapons later in life. If a former Eromenos felt he had been exploited, or if the relationship did not end on good terms, he could hold a grudge. Decades later, in the heat of a political battle, a rival might dig up an old scandal, accusing a man of having behaved improperly as a youth or of continuing a shameful relationship into adulthood. The private lives of politicians were very much fair game in the cutthroat world of Athenian democracy. This leads to a point of scholarly contention: how rigid was this bearded rule? Was it an absolute cutoff? Or was there some flexibility? The mainstream literary and philosophical sources, written by the elite for the elite, present a very clear picture: beard equals man, man equals end of relationship. This idea was powerful. However, some scholars, looking at different kinds of evidence, like graffiti or the more vulgar comedies, suggest that the reality on the ground might have been more varied. They argue that while the ideal relationship ended, other forms of same-sex relationships between adult men might have continued more privately, outside the formal institution of paiderastia. The key difference is that these would not have been celebrated publicly in the same way. An adult man having a long-term relationship with another adult man wasn't illegal, but it lacked the social and educational justification of paiderastia. It would have been viewed simply as a personal preference, and as long as both partners continued to fulfill their civic duties, marrying, having children, serving the state, society might have largely looked the way. The great taboo was not the relationship itself, but the shirking of one's public responsibilities. The evidence for this is sparse and often ambiguous, forcing historians to read between the lines of insults and jokes to try and reconstruct the lives of those who didn't follow the standard script. So as you, the former Eromenos, look at your reflection in a polished bronze mirror and see the undeniable proof of your manhood. You stand at a crossroads. The path of the beloved is now closed to you. The path of the citizen, the husband, the father, and perhaps one day, the Aristes yourself, lies open before you. The chapter of your youth is over, and the great project of Athenian manhood has begun. Let's journey away from the male-dominated spaces of mainland Athens for a moment. We're taking a ship across the Aegean Sea, heading east. The air becomes saltier, the light seems softer. We are approaching an island lush with olive groves and vineyards, a place renowned for its culture and, in particular, its poetry. We have arrived at Lesbos, in the 6th century BC, a full century before the Athens we've been exploring. And here, we are looking for one of the most famous and enigmatic figures from the ancient world, the poet Sappho. When we talk about female relationships in ancient Greece, Sappho's name is the first, and often the only, one that comes to mind. The very word lesbian comes from the name of her hull, Lesbos. The term Sapphic comes directly from her name. But what do we actually know about her and the women she wrote about? The answer is frustratingly little, and most of it is shrouded in mystery and centuries of speculation. Imagine you are a young, aristocratic woman on Lesbos. You have been sent to be part of a group of Theasos, centered around the celebrated poet, Sappho. This is not a formal school in our sense. It is a collective of young, unmarried women from wealthy families, gathered together under Sappho's mentorship. Your purpose here is to receive a cultural education to prepare you for marriage. You learn to sing, to play the lyre, to dance, and to appreciate beauty and grace. Sappho is your teacher, your mentor, the leader of your circle. The atmosphere here is different from the rigid seclusion of an Athenian gymnasium. Here, in this all-female community, there is a focus on art, beauty, and the expression of emotion. Sappho's role is to cultivate your refinement, to make you a desirable bride for a man from a good family. This was, on the surface, her socially sanctioned function. But then, you listen to the poetry. Sappho's poems, of which we now only have fragments, are intensely personal, emotional, and often directed at the young women within her circle. She writes of their beauty with breathtaking intimacy. She describes the sweet bitter pain of love, the jealousy she feels when a girl she cares for speaks to a man, the deep sorrow of a girl leaving the circle to be married. One of her most famous surviving fragments, Fragment 31, describes her physical reaction to seeing a girl she loves talking with a man. She says her tongue is frozen. A delicate fire runs beneath her skin. She can't see. Her ears are humming. And she is overcome with trembling, turning paler than grass. This is not abstract philosophical love. This is a visceral, powerful, and deeply personal emotional experience. The poetry is undeniably passionate and homoerotic. This brings us to the great, unresolved question about Sappho. What was the actual nature of these relationships for centuries? Particularly in the Victorian era, scholars tried to clean up Sappho's image. They argued that she was merely a respectable headmistress of a girls' finishing school, and that her passionate language was just conventional poetic metaphor, a way of expressing non-physical, mental affection for her students. They painted her as a chaste widow, a model of propriety. However, most modern scholars find this interpretation unconvincing. The language of the poems feels too raw, too personal to be merely a literary exercise. The modern consensus is that Sappho's circle almost certainly involved homoerotic relationships. The debate has shifted. The question is no longer if these relationships existed, but what their social function and meaning were. Here's a specific detail that complicates the picture. Sappho herself was, according to tradition, married to a man and had a daughter. This wasn't seen as a contradiction. In the ancient world, sexual behavior was not tied to a fixed identity in the way we think of it today. A person's sexual acts did not define them as homosexual or heterosexual, while also forming deep, passionate, and physical bonds with women in her circle. Some historians have proposed a model that mirrors the male institution of paideia. They suggest that these relationships were part of a ritualized, educational process. An older woman like Sappho would form a bond with a younger girl, mentoring her in the arts of love and grace to prepare her for her future role as a wife. The homoerotic relationship would be a temporary phase, an initiation into womanhood that would end upon marriage. In this view, the passionate love Sappho expresses is part of a socially accepted, even expected, part of a young woman's development on Lesbos. But this is where we have to admit the limits of our knowledge. This is the scholars are still debating part on steroids. The evidence is so fragmentary. Most of Sappho's 9 volumes of poetry have been lost. What we have are scraps, quotes in other ancient authors, and lines recovered from recycled papyrus used to wrap mummies in Egypt. We are trying to reconstruct an entire emotional world from a handful of beautiful, broken lines. We have almost no other direct evidence for love between women in ancient Greece. Athenian legal texts are silent on the matter, likely because female relationships posed no threat to the all-important male inheritance line. As long as a woman produced a legitimate heir for her husband, what she did with other women in the privacy of the Guinness was largely invisible and irrelevant to the male-run state. Aristophanes makes some jokes about it, and Plato mentions it in passing, but we lack the rich tapestry of sources we have for male relationships. Sappho and her circle on Lesbos remain a tantalizing, beautiful anomaly. Was Lesbos a unique safe haven for female homoerotimistas, or was this kind of emotional and physical intimacy between women more common throughout Greece, but simply unrecorded by male writers? We don't know for sure. So, as you sit in a sun-drenched courtyard on Lesbos, the sound of a lyre and a clear female voice singing of love and longing fills the air. You are in a world built by women, for women. A world of intense beauty, deep bonds, and heartbreaking farewells. It is a world that we can only glimpse through the shattered mirror of Sappho's surviving poetry. Let's return to the bustling, dusty streets of Athens, but this time, we're not going to a respectable citizen's home or an elite symposium. We're heading to the grittier parts of the city, perhaps near the port of Piraeus or the crowded market areas. We need to talk about a group of people who were an accepted, visible, and yet largely disdained part of everyday life: the sex workers. And at the bottom of this profession's hierarchy, you find the pornei. The word porni, the singular of porne, is the root of our modern word pornography. It literally means one who is for sale. This was not a subtle euphemism, it was a blunt and accurate description of their status. A porni was a person, almost always a slave, whose body was a commodity to be bought and sold for the sexual gratification of others. They had little to no agency over their own lives. Imagine you are walking through a less reputable neighborhood. You see the brothels, the porni. These are not lavish, hidden establishments. They are often simple, state-licensed houses, sometimes marked by a painted phallus or a lamp. Inside, the conditions are basic. The pornei who work here are typically owned by a brothel keeper, a porneboscoes. This figure, the pimp, was one of the most reviled in Athenian society. He was seen as a man who profited from the degradation of others, a truly dishonorable profession. The women and sometimes young men working as pornei were usually not Athenian. They were often slaves captured in war, abandoned infants who were rescued and raised for this purpose, or foreigners who had fallen on hard times. They were at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. They had no legal rights to speak of. Their owner could sell them, beat them, and force them to serve any number of clients a day. Their lives were often short and brutal. As an Athenian man, visiting a pornei was not a source of great shame. It was seen as a simple, necessary transaction, a way to satisfy a basic physical urge without complicating your life or threatening the social order. It was cheap, it was available, and it kept you away from the wives and daughters of other citizens. The statesman Solon, as we mentioned, was even credited with establishing public brothels as a kind of civic utility, like an aqueduct or a public bath. It was pragmatic. The city recognized that male desire existed, and it was better to channel it into a controlled, taxable outlet than to have it cause social disruption. Here's a small but telling detail about their lives. Pornei were often required by custom, if not by law, to wear distinctive clothing. They might have had to wear colorful, showy dresses or dye their hair in a particular way. Blonde was often associated with them, as it was an exotic hair color. This was a way of marking them, of making them instantly identifiable and separating them from respectable women. A veiled, soberly dressed woman was a citizen's wife. A brightly dressed, unaccompanied woman was likely a pornei. The city was visualized to reflect its social hierarchies. While many pornei were slaves confined to brothels, some had a slight degree of autonomy. These were the so-called streetwalkers who might work for themselves, though they were still at the bottom rung of society. You might see them in the agora or near the city gates, soliciting clients. Their price was notoriously low. There's a famous line from a comedian that the price was 1 obol, an incredibly small coin, the equivalent of a loaf of bread. This was likely a comic exaggeration, but it speaks to how devalued their services were. The existence of the porne raises a challenging question for historians, and it's a subject of ongoing debate. How did the widespread availability of cheap, transactional sex affect the other relationships in Greek society? One school of thought argues that it created a deep emotional chasm. This view suggests that because men could easily satisfy their purely physical desires with porne, they were less inclined to see their wives or even their paid erotic partners as sources of physical passion. It reinforced the strict compartmentalizacity of Greek life. You go to a porne for sex, you marry a wife for children, and you seek out an eromenos for a noble, educative romance. In this model, love, sex, and family are three completely separate spheres. However, other scholars argue this is too simplistic. They suggest that human emotions don't fit into such neat boxes. They point out that even if a man visited a porne, it didn't necessarily mean he felt no passion for his wife or love for his male partner. They argue that the porne served more as a social safety valve, an option that existed but didn't define the entirety of a man's emotional or sexual life. They also remind us that our sources are almost all written by an elite men. We have no first-hand accounts from the porne themselves. Their voices are completely silent in the historical record. We see them only through the eyes of the men who used them, legislated them, and mocked them in plays. We can describe their social function and their legal status, but we can only guess at the fear, despair, or resilience that marked their daily existence. So as you walk past the brothel, you may catch a glimpse of a woman's face in a doorway. She is a part of the city's machinery, as necessary and as unremarked upon as the drains beneath the street. Her existence makes the orderly, respectable world of the citizens' wakers possible. She is the hidden, silent foundation upon which much of the city's sexual morality, with its carefully constructed rules and social fictions, is built. Now let's leave the grim reality of the porne behind and climb the social ladder. A very long way up. We're going back to the Symposium, that exclusive, all-male drinking party. But this time, I want you to pay close attention to a particular woman who has been allowed into this sacred male space. She is not a silent flute player or a background dancer. She is reclining on a couch, just like the men. She is witty, she is educated, and she is holding her own in a philosophical debate with the most brilliant minds in Athens. You are in the presence of a hetaira. The word hetaira translates to female companion, and that's a far more accurate description of her role than any modern equivalent. The hetairae were a class of women entirely distinct from citizen wives and from the porne. They were, in essence, professional mistresses and high-class courtesans. But that description barely scratches the surface of what they were. They were the exception to almost every rule that governed the lives of other women in Athens. First and foremost, a hetaira was often a foreigner, a metic. This was a crucial part of her status, because she was not an Athenian citizen. She was not bound by the same oppressive rules of seclusion and silence that govern citizen wives. She could move freely through the city. She could own property. She could manage her own finances. She had a degree of independence that was unthinkable for a respectable Athenian woman. Her primary trade was not just sex, it was companionship. A man would seek out a hetaira for her conversation, her wit, her cultural refinement, and her charm. She was educated. She could read, write, play music, and, most importantly, she could hold an intelligent conversation about art, literature, and politics. She was the fun woman, the one you could actually talk to and relax with, in a way you often couldn't with your much younger, uneducated, and secluded wife. The Symposium was her natural habitat. She was the only type of woman who could participate in these gatherings, offering not just her beauty, but her intellect. The relationships men formed with hetaira were often long-term. A wealthy man might have an exclusive arrangement with a single hetaira, essentially setting her up as his mistress. This was not a secret, shameful affair. It was often quite public. He would take her to parties, be seen with her, and support her financially. This relationship did not threaten his marriage, because any children he had with the Hetaira would not be citizens and could not inherit his property. His legal wife was for heirs, his Hetaira was for pleasure and partnership. Here's a specific and fascinating detail that sets them apart: their names. While a citizen's wife was ideally never named in public, famous Hetaira were known by their names across the Greek world. Their names often reflected their appeal. You had women named Frying Toad, a nickname possibly meant ironically for her beauty, the RT God's gift, or Les Lioness. They cultivated public personas, almost like modern celebrities. Phryne was so famous for her beauty that she was said to have been the model for the legendary statue of Aphrodite of Knidos. The story goes that when she was on trial for impiety, her lawyer, failing to persuade the jury with words, simply disrobed her in the courtroom. The jury of citizen men, so struck by her divine beauty, acquitted her on the spot. It's probably a fabricated story, but the fact that it was told and believed shows the legendary status these women could achieve. The most famous Hetaira of all was Aspasia of Miletus. She was the partner of the great Athenian statesman, Pericles. She was not just his mistress, she was his intellectual equal and confidant. Plato and Socrates reportedly went to her to learn rhetoric. She ran a salon that attracted the most brilliant thinkers and artists of her time. She was a political advisor and a brilliant speechwriter. Of course, her power and intelligence made her a target. Pericles' enemies mocked him, calling him a slave to his foreign mistress and spreading rumors that she ran a brothel. They couldn't attack Pericles directly, so they attacked the brilliant, unconventional woman by his side. This brings us to a major point of debate for classicists: how much freedom did the Hetaira really have on the surface? They seemed to be the most liberated women in Greece. They had education, financial independence, and social mobility. They could converse with the greatest men of their age. However, some historians urge caution. They argue that a Hetaira's freedom was precarious and entirely dependent on her ability to please powerful men. Her career was based on her beauty and charm, which were fleeting. An aging Hetaira with no savings could find herself in a desperate situation. She was still, ultimately, selling a service in a man's world. While she had more agency than a pawnee or a citizen's wife, her freedom was conditional, not absolute. She was still an outsider, and her position was never truly secure. She had to be constantly clever, constantly charming, constantly one step ahead to maintain her status and her livelihood. Was her life one of glamorous empowerment or one of a gilded cage exploitation? The truth is, it was a complex navigation between the two. The Hetaira represents a fascinating paradox in Greek society. She was a woman who was celebrated for possessing the very qualities: intellect, public presence, and wit that were actively suppressed in citizen women. She carved out a unique, powerful, and risky niche for herself in a world that had no official place for a woman like her. She was, in every sense of the word, exceptional. Let's turn our gaze back up to Mount Olympus for a moment. We started with the gods, and it's worth returning to them, because the stories you tell about them are more than just entertainment. They are a reflection of your deepest cultural assumptions about power, desire, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Specifically, let's look at the recurring theme of gods pursuing mortal women. You grew up with these stories. You know them by heart. There's the tale of Zeus and Danae. Her father, a king, locks her away in a bronze chamber to prevent a prophecy that his grandson will kill him. But you can't lock out the king of the gods. Zeus, ever the creative suitor, transforms himself into a shower of golden rain, pouring through the roof of her prison and impregnating her. The result of this union is the hero Perseus. Or consider the story of Apollo and Daphne. Apollo, the god of music, poetry, and reason, is struck by one of Cupid's arrows and falls madly in love with the nymph Daphne. He pursues her relentlessly. So, However, wants nothing to do with him and has sworn to remain a virgin. She flees from him, and in her desperation, prays to her father, a river god, to save her. He saves her by transforming her into a laurel tree just as Apollo's hands reach her. The heartbroken god then declares the laurel to be his sacred plant, and you see victors at the Pythian Games crowned with laurel wreaths in his honor. These stories are everywhere. They are carved into the friezes of your temples and painted on the pottery you use every day. But what are they really about on the surface? They are exciting tales of divine romance and adventure. But, if you look a little closer, they reveal a rather uncomfortable pattern. The courtship is almost always a one-sided pursuit. The god desires, and the mortal is the object of that desire. The mortal's consent is often secondary, if not entirely irrelevant. Zeus doesn't ask Leda if she'd like to meet his one, he just becomes one. Poseidon doesn't ask Hermes for a date, he takes what he wants. This dynamic of divine pursuit directly mirrors the power structures you see on Earth. The gods act like the most powerful of aristocratic men, taking what they desire simply because they can. Their actions reflect a worldview where power and desire are inextricably linked. The pursuer is active, dominant, and male, or at least takes a male role. The pursued is passive, receptive, and often female. This narrative powerfully reinforces the gender roles we've already explored in the human world. It's the cosmic version of the dynamic between a citizen man and, well, almost everyone else. Here's a small, curious detail that adds another layer. In some of these stories, after the encounter, the god grants the mortal woman a boon or a gift. After Poseidon assaults Genese, he offers her a wish. Her wish is to be turned into an invulnerable man, the warrior Cyaneus, so that she may never be violated again. It's a tragic and complex twist. The gift she asks for is an escape from her own vulnerability. The story doesn't question the god's right to act, but it does explore the profound consequences for the mortal involved. This leads to a point of scholarly debate that is still very active. How did the Greeks themselves interpret these stories? Were these tales of divineness all seen as tragic and terrifying, or were they viewed as a strange kind of honor? The traditional interpretation often leans towards the latter. To be desired by a god, even in a violent or coercive way, was to be singled out. It made you special. More importantly, it made your offspring special. As we mentioned before, having a god in your family tree was the ultimate status symbol. The great heroes of your culture, Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, were all products of these unions. So while the experience might have been traumatic for the mortal woman involved, the result was a demigod who would bring glory to his city and his people. The story of Danae being locked in a bronze room isn't just about Zeus's power, it's the necessary prelude to the birth of the hero Perseus, the slayer of Medusa. The myth serves a civic and genealogical purpose that might have overshadowed the personal violation at its core. However, many contemporary scholars, particularly those influenced by feminist theory, are re-examining these myths. They argue that we should not downplay the violence and coercion inherent in these stories. They suggest that to view them only as honors is to adopt the perspective of the powerful god and the patriarchal society that created him. They encourage us to read the myths from the perspective of Danae, Leda, or Daphne. When we do that, the stories become much darker. They become tales of trauma, resistance, and the profound injustice of a world where even the gods are not held accountable. They argue that Greek tragedies, which often explore the suffering that results from divine meddling, show that the ancients themselves were deeply aware of this dark side. The playwrights, at least, were not afraid to show that being an object of a god's desire was often a terrible curse. So the next time you look at a vase painting of a god chasing a nymph, you're seeing more than just a pretty picture. You are seeing a complex cultural artifact that is simultaneously a justification for earthly power structures, a foundational story for heroic lineages, and, perhaps, a tragic exploration of what it feels like to be powerless in the face of overwhelming desire. The myths didn't provide easy answers, they wrestled with the most difficult questions of their time. Let's step back into the oikos, into the heart of the Getty, and focus on the single most important and most dangerous event in an Athenian woman's life: childbirth. So you, as the wife of a citizen, your entire purpose, as defined by society, is to produce a legitimate heir. But this sacred duty came with a terrifyingly high risk. In a world without modern medicine, childbirth was a life-or-death struggle. Imagine you are a young wife, pregnant for the first time. The experience is shrouded in a mixture of hope and fear. Hope, because a successful birth, especially of a son, will solidify your position in the household and earn you immense respect. Fear, because you have undoubtedly heard stories of friends, sisters, or neighbors who died in the process. The statesman Pericles, in his famous funeral oration, praised the men who died for Athens in battle. But other writers were quick to point out that women faced their own battlefield in the home. The playwright Euripides has his character Medea say she would rather stand in the battle line 3 times than give birth once. This was not hyperbole, it was a reflection of a grim reality. The understanding of pregnancy and reproduction was, by our standards, a strange mix of astute observation and complete fantasy. The dominant medical theory, coming from thinkers like Hippocrates and Aristotle, was that both the man and the woman produced a seed. The man's seed was hot and active, and it was the primary agent of creation. The woman's seed was cold and passive. When they combined in the womb, the man's seed would cook the woman's contribution, forming a fetus. They believed that if the hot male seed was dominant, the child would be a boy. If the cold female element was stronger, it would be a girl. This led to all sorts of folk advice for conceiving a son, like tying off one's left testicle, which was believed to produce female seed. When the time for labor comes, it is an exclusively female event. You are surrounded by the women of your household, your mother, your female slaves, and most importantly, the midwife. The mayor, no men are allowed. The midwife is not a formally trained doctor, but an experienced older woman who has likely given birth herself and has assisted in many others. Her knowledge is a mix of practical techniques and religious ritual, passed down through generations. The birth itself is arduous. You might be asked to walk around, to squat, or to sit on a birthing stool, a special chair with a U-shaped hole in the seat. This was actually a very effective, gravity-assisted position. The midwife would be there to guide you, to massage you, and to offer encouragement. But, if complications arose, her options were limited. A breech birth, a hemorrhage, or an infection could quickly become a death sentence for both you and the child. Let's look at a small, specific detail of the process: the role of the gods. Childbirth was seen as a moment when the natural and supernatural worlds converged. You would pray intensely to goddesses who presided over this domain. Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, was paradoxically also a key protector of women in labor, and Hya was the goddess specifically of childbirth, whose presence was required for a safe delivery. You might have amulets tied to your body, and the midwife would be chanting prayers and incantations. If the labor was difficult, it was thought that a god might be angry, or that in a nearby rock would be magically knotting the womb. Magic and medicine were completely intertwined. After the birth, if you and the child have survived, the danger is not over. Postpartum infections were common and deadly, but if all goes well, a series of rituals marks the baby's entry into the family. An olive branch for a boy or a woolen strip for a girl is hung on the front door to announce the birth to the neighborhood. This is where a deeply controversial and difficult subject comes into play. Something scholars still debate: the frequency of infant exposure. A few days after the birth, your husband, the Kyrios, would have to formally accept the child into the oikos. If he did not, for any reason, if the child was deformed, if it was a girl and the family couldn't afford another dowry, or if he suspected it was not his, he had the legal right to order the infant to be exposed. This meant the baby would be left in a public place, often in a pot or a basket, to either be picked up by a passerby or to die. Historians are deeply divided on how common this practice actually was. The literary sources. Like plays and myths, the story of Oedipus begins with his exposure as an infant. Also of it, this suggests it was, at the very least, a known and culturally thinkable act. Some scholars argue that it was a grim but necessary form of family planning in a world with no effective contraception, particularly for poor families. They suggest that female infants were exposed at a much higher rate than males. However, other historians argue that the literary evidence is misleading. They suggest that these stories are dramatic exceptions, not everyday occurrences. They point to archaeological evidence, which has not uncovered the vast numbers of infant skeletons we might expect if exposure were rampant. They also argue that the emotional bonds of family would have made it a truly desperate, last resort measure. It's a dark and unsettling question with no easy answer. Was this a common tragedy or a rare horror? We may never know for sure. For you, the new mother, having survived the ordeal and seen your child accepted, your status is transformed. You have fulfilled your primary function. You have done your duty to your husband, to his ancestors, and to the future of his oikos. You have faced your own battle and won. You survived childbirth, and your child has been accepted into the oikos. But now you and your husband face a new set of practical concerns. Perhaps the oikos is struggling financially and cannot support another child. Perhaps you already have a male heir and several daughters, and the prospect of another dowry is daunting. Or perhaps, for your own health, you simply cannot endure another high-risk pregnancy. You need a way to control your family's size. Welcome to the world of ancient Greek family planning. In an era long before hormonal pills or latex, people had to get creative. The methods they used were a fascinating, and often alarming, blend of folk wisdom, magical thinking, and occasionally a kernel of scientific observation. The primary responsibility for contraception, as you might guess, fell upon you, the woman. The most common advice, recommended by medical writers like Soranus of Ephesus, who was technically Roman but compiled a lot of earlier Greek knowledge, involved timing. It was widely believed that the most fertile time was right after menstruation. This is, of course, the exact opposite of the truth. A mistake that probably led to a great many surprise pregnancies. This fundamental misunderstanding of the female reproductive cycle was a huge obstacle to any effective method. Beyond timing, things got a lot more hands-on. The main strategy was to create some kind of barrier. You might be advised to fashion a sort of pessary, a wad of soft wool, which you would soak in various substances before inserting it into your body. The concoctions used were imaginative. Olive oil was a common choice, which might have had a minor spermicide effect. Honey was also used, for its thicknesses, but then things get strange. You might be told to use cedar gum, lead ointment, or even crocodile dung. The theory behind the crocodile dung, which sounds absolutely bizarre to us, was likely based on a form of sympathetic magic. Crocodiles are scaly and dry, so perhaps their dung would dry up the womb and make it inhospitable to seed. It goes without saying these methods were not only ineffective, but also posed a serious risk of infection. Another common approach was pharmacological. You would be advised to eat or drink certain plants believed to have contraceptive properties. The most famous of these was a plant called sulfium. This was a species of giant fennel that grew only in a narrow coastal strip of North Africa, near the Greek colony of Serene. It was a legendary plant, worth its weight in silver. The ancient Greeks and Romans swore by its effectiveness as both a contraceptive and an abortifacient, a substance that induces abortion. The plant was so important to Cyrene's economy that its image was stamped on their coins. Here's a fascinating and rather sad detail. Sulfium was so popular and so valuable that it was harvested to extinction. The last known stalk was reportedly given to the Roman Emperor Nero as a curiosity. We can't be sure what it was or how it worked, because it no longer exists. Modern botanists have tried to identify it, suggesting it might be a relative of other fennel plants that are known to have estrogenic properties. That we'll never know for sure. It is a ghost in the ancient pharmacopoeia. a testament to how desperately people sought a reliable form of birth control. If contraception failed, the next, far more dangerous option was abortion. This was a legal and socially complex issue. There was no blanket prohibition against it. The key question was not about the moral status of the fetus, but about the rights of the Kyrios, the head of the household. If your husband consented to the abortion, it was generally permissible. However, if you had an abortion without his knowledge or against his will, you could be prosecuted. The crime was not murder, it was depriving him of a potential heir, a theft against his oikos. The methods for inducing an abortion were rough and dangerous. They included ingesting powerful herbal concoctions like silphium, or other toxic plants, vigorous physical activity like jumping or carrying heavy loads, or more invasive procedures performed by a midwife. These methods carried an extremely high risk of hemorrhage, infection, and death for the woman. The philosophical and medical communities were themselves divided on the issue, a debate that has echoed through the centuries. The Hippocratic Oath, which some doctors swore, contains the famous line, "I will not give to a woman a pessary to cause abortion." This suggests that a faction of the medical community was opposed to the practice, seeing it as a violation of their duty to preserve life. However, many other doctors and philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, saw it as a legitimate and sometimes necessary tool for population control in his design for an ideal state in the Republic. Plato suggests that the number of births should be strictly controlled by the rulers. Aristotle, in his Politics, is even more explicit. He writes that if a couple has too many children, let abortion be procured before sense and life have begun. He then goes on to debate the exact point at which a fetus gains sense and life. A philosophical argument about ens soul meant that continues to this day. The fact that the greatest minds of the age were discussing the practicalities of abortion shows it was a very real part of their world. So for you, as an Athenian woman, navigating your reproductive life was a high-stakes gamble. You were armed with a mixture of misinformation, dangerous potions, and risky procedures. The desire to control the size of your family was a powerful one, driven by economic, social, and personal pressures. But the tools at your disposal were unreliable at best and deadly at worst. It was another hidden battlefield, another area where women bore the greatest risks in a society that depended entirely on their bodies. Let's take a moment to talk about what was considered physically beautiful in ancient Greece. When you walk through a museum today, you see rows of star-white marble statues. They're elegant, they're idealized, but they're also a bit misleading. The real Greek world was far more colorful, and their standards of beauty were both familiar and surprisingly specific. First, let's talk about the male ideal. You only need to look at the statues of gods and heroes to see what was prized: a body that was athletic, balanced, and harmonious. It wasn't about being a hulking bodybuilder. The ideal physique, as seen in sculptures like the Dori Ph or Os the Spear Bearer, was one of lean muscle, clear definition, and perfect proportion. This wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a moral one. A beautiful body was the sign of a beautiful mind and a disciplined spirit. It showed that you spent time in the gymnasium, that you were a good citizen preparing yourself for warfare. It was a physical manifestation of inner excellence, a concept they called kalokogathia, the fusion of beauty and goodness. But the statues don't tell the whole story. For one, they weren't originally white. They were painted in vibrant, some might say garish, colors. Hair was often gilded gold, eyes were inlaid with colored stones, and skin was painted a sun-kissed bronze. The stark, minimalist aesthetic we associate with them is an accident of time. The real Greek statues looked enlivened, to our eyes, maybe even a little tacky. And here's a quirky detail about the male ideal that often gets noticed today: the size of the genitalia on these statues. They are consistently, almost comically, small by modern standards. This was intentional. In the Greek mindset, a large, erect phallus was associated with barbarians, satyrs, and old, lecherous men. It was a sign of uncontrolled lust and a lack of self-discipline. The ideal citizen, the man of reason and moderation, was depicted with small, non-aroused genitals. It was a visual symbol of his self-control sophrosyne. So, the next time you see a Greek statue, remember that this feature wasn't a mistake, it was a status symbol of a very different kind. Now, let's turn to the female standard of beauty. This is harder to pin down, because respectable women were not depicted nude as often as men were. But from the statues of goddesses like Aphrodite and the descriptions in poetry, we can piece together a picture. The ideal was a body that was softer and plumper than the male ideal. A little bit of roundness in the belly and hips was a sign of health and fertility, which was, after all, a woman's primary virtue. When it came to the face, the standards were very precise. A straight, classical nose that formed an almost perfect line with the forehead was considered the height of beauty. Pale skin was also highly prized for upper-class women. Why? Because it was a status symbol. If your skin was pale, it meant you didn't have to work outside in the sun. It was a sign that you belonged to a wealthy oikos and could afford the luxury of seclusion in the Guinea Sea. You might even use cosmetics to enhance this paleness, applying powders made from white lead. This was, of course, highly toxic, a dangerous price to pay for fashion. And here is my favorite weird but true detail about female beauty: the unibrow. Yes, you heard that right. A soft, dark unibrow, or monobrow, was considered a particularly beautiful and desirable feature on a woman. The empty space between the eyebrows was seen as plain. For women who weren't naturally blessed with this feature, they might use a dark powder, like coal, to paint in the connecting bridge. Some sources even suggest they would fashion false eyebrows out of dyed goat hair and stick them on with tree resin. It's a striking reminder of how arbitrary and culturally specific our standards of beauty really are. The feature that someone today might pluck or wax was, for the ancient Greeks, the height of sex appeal. But who decided these standards? This is a point of ongoing discussion among historians and art historians. The male-dominated society obviously played the biggest role. The standards for women were largely defined by the male gaze, what men found desirable in a wife: fertility, modesty, or a hetero charm. Allure. The depiction of the ideal male body was also created by men, for men, as a model of civic virtue. However, some scholars argue that we shouldn't discount female agency entirely. In the closed-off world of the Guinea Sea, or the all-female circle of Sappho, women surely had their own internal standards of beauty and adornment. They would have judged each other's skill in weaving beautiful fabrics, in applying cosmetics, and in arranging their hair in intricate braids. These were arts practiced by women, for an audience of other women, unfortunately, because they didn't write the poems or sculpt the statues. This female perspective on beauty is almost entirely lost to us. We are left to reconstruct it from the reflections we see in a male-dominated culture. So, as you walk the streets of Athens, you are surrounded by a very specific set of aesthetic values. You see the bronzed, athletic bodies of young men heading to the gymnasium, a testament to their civic duty, and you might catch a fleeting glimpse of a wealthy wife, her face a pale, powdered mask of respectability, perhaps even sporting a fashionable unibrow. It's a world where physical beauty is never just sky deep, it is a language that speaks of your status, your virtue, and your place in the social order. Let's head over to one of the most important public spaces in any Greek city, a place that was part social club, part school, and part training ground. We are going to the gymnasium. The word itself comes from the Greek gymnos, which means naked. And that tells you the most important thing you need to know about what goes on here. You, as an Athenian citizen or a youth aspiring to be one, would spend a significant amount of your time at the gymnasium. You arrive and strip off your clothes in a changing room. All of them. You then coat your body in a thin layer of olive oil. This wasn't for tanning, it was to protect your skin from the sun and dust, and to make it harder for a wrestling opponent to get a firm grip. Then, You and hundreds of other naked men and boys of all ages would proceed to the open-air courtyards to exercise. The scene would be one of controlled, athletic energy. In one area, you see men practicing the javelin throw. In another, a group is competing in the long jump, using heavy stone weights called hold to rest to propel themselves forward. And in the sandpit, the palestro, you see wrestlers grappling, their whole bodies glistening in the sun. This is not a casual workout. This is serious business. The skills you are honing here, running, wrestling, throwing, are the core skills of a hoplite warrior. Your physical fitness is a direct contribution to the city's military readiness. But the gymnasium was for more than just physical training. It was a buzzing social hub. Older men would come simply to watch the youths, to socialize with their peers, and to engage in conversation. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle established their famous schools, the Academy and the Lyceum, in or adjacent to gymnasia. It was the perfect place to find young, ambitious minds to teach. You might finish your wrestling practice and then go sit under a portico to listen to a famous sophist debate the nature of justice. It was a place for the education of the whole man, both body and mind. The nudity was central to the entire experience. For the Greeks, there was nothing inherently shameful or sexual about the naked male body. In fact, it was something to be celebrated and admired, as long as it was in the proper context. Nudity in the gymnasium was a sign of civilization. It was the barbarians, they thought, who were ashamed of their bodies and kept them covered. This public nudity also acted as a great equalizer. Stripped of fine clothes and armor, a man's worth was judged by the quality of his physique and his character, not the wealth of his family. Now for a specific and slightly gross detail of gymnasium life. After your workout, caked in oil, sweat, and dust, you wouldn't just take a shower. You would use a special tool called a S3X. This was a curved metal scraper. You or a slave, if you were wealthy, would use it to scrape the oily grime off your body. This gunk, known as glow ios, was considered to have medicinal properties. It was collected and sold as an ingredient for ointments and potions to treat aches and pains. So the sweat of famous athletes was literally bottled and sold. It's the ancient equivalent of celebrity-endorsed sports cream. Of course, the environment of the gymnasium, with its mix of older men and beautiful, naked youths, made it the primary stage for the courtship rituals of paiderastia. The Aristes would come to watch his chosen Neromenos train, to admire his physical prowess and grace. The boy, in turn, knew he was being watched, and would be motivated to perform at his best. The gymnasium was a theater of athletic and romantic competition. This leads to a fascinating and much debated question among historians: how did they prevent this all-male, naked environment from devolving into a chaotic free-for-all? Was it really as non-sexual as the philosophical ideal suggests? The evidence points to a complex set of unwritten rules and social controls. While desire was an accepted part of the atmosphere, acting on it inappropriately was not. There were officials, called gymnasia or CHS, who were responsible for maintaining order. Laws existed that regulated who could enter the gymnasium and when. For example, some laws prohibited older men from entering the wrestling schools at the same time as the young boys, likely to prevent improper advances. Furthermore, the emphasis was always on self-control. Rosy knee, an older man who couldn't control himself, who made an overt or vulgar pass at a boy in the open, would be shamed. A boy who behaved seductively or promiscuously would ruin his reputation. The nudity was supposed to be disciplined and purposeful, not for display. It was for athletics, not for display. Some scholars believe this ideal of disciplined nudity was largely successful. They argue that the Greeks were masters of competition ethnicity, and were able to separate athletic nudity from eroticism in this specific context. The gymnasium was a sacred space for the cultivation of civic and military virtue, and this shared purpose tempered the underlying sexual tensions. Other historians are more skeptical. They read between the lines of the comedies and the court cases and suggest that the reality was probably a lot messier. They argue that the gymnasium was undoubtedly a place of intense sexual tension and that the rules were likely broken all the time. They see it less as a chaste space of philosophical education and more as a cruising ground where the line between admirable gazing and lecherous gawking was constantly being negotiated and sometimes crossed. What is certain is that the gymnasium was a uniquely Greek institution. It was a place where the city's ideals of physical beauty, military strength, and intellectual rigor all came together. As you scrape the oil from your skin, the feeling of pleasant exhaustion in your muscles, you are participating in the very process of creating a citizen. You are shaping your body to serve the state, and in doing so, you are affirming your place in the male-centric world of the polis. We spent a lot of time talking about what was permitted in ancient Greek society, the visit to the brothel, the affair with the hetera, the educative love for a beautiful boy. All of these were, to varying degrees, socially acceptable for a citizen man, as long as he followed the rules. But this raises an important question: what was actually forbidden? What were the true sexual taboos? The acts that would genuinely shock a Greek and lead to severe punishment or social ostracism? The answer might surprise you, because the Greeks didn't think in terms of sins or universal moral laws. Their prohibitions were almost entirely rooted in the social and civic order. The lines were drawn around status, family, and the integrity of the citizen body. The absolute, number one taboo, the crime we touched on before, was moichii, adultery with the wife of a fellow citizen. Let's be crystal clear about this again. The crime was not about infidelity in general. A man sleeping with a slave, a foreigner, or a sex worker was not an adulterer. The crime was specifically about violating another citizen's oikos. You were trespassing on his property and, most importantly, you were threatening to pollute his bloodline with a child that was not his. This was an existential threat to the entire system of inheritance and citizenship. The punishment for moichii could be severe. If a husband caught a man in the act with his wife, the law gave him the right to kill the adulterer on the spot without facing murder charges. This is not to say every cuckolded husband resorted to this, but the legality of it shows the gravity of the offense. More commonly, the adulterer would be captured and held for ransom. His family would have to pay a hefty sum to get him back. Public humiliation was also a popular and brutal punishment. One recorded practice was rough-on doses, or radishing, where a large radish would be, well, used in a very unpleasant and humiliating way on the adulterer. It was a punishment designed to unman him, to treat him with the ultimate dishonor. The second major taboo was incest. But again, their definition of incest was narrower and more specific than ours. A relationship between a parent and a child, or between full siblings who shared the same mother, was seen as horrific and unnatural. This is the stuff of tragedy, like Oedipus marrying his mother, an act that brings a plague upon his entire city. This kind of incest was a violation of the fundamental order of the family and the cosmos. However, here's a strange and specific exception that highlights their peculiar logic. In Athens, it was legal for a man to marry his half-sister, provided they had the same father but different mothers. This was because the oikos and the family line were raced through the father. A half-sister from a different mother was not considered part of your immediate maternal bloodline, and marrying her could be a very practical way to keep a family's property and dowry consolidated. It feels deeply uncomfortable to us, but for them, it was a legally unsocially acceptable practice that served the economic interests of the patriarchal family unit. Conversely, marrying a half-sister who shared your mother but not your father was forbidden, because that was seen as a confusion of the bloodlines. Another absolute taboo was coercing a freeborn boy. While paiderastia was an accepted institution, it was meant to be a courtship. An heiress who used violence or force against a youth was not just a criminal, he was committing hybris, that act of outrageous insolence. The crime wasn't the sex, but the dishonoring of a future citizen. The integrity of the citizen body was paramount, and a boy was a citizen in training. His honor had to be protected. This brings us to a complex and highly debated topic: was rape a major crime in ancient Greece? The answer is complicated and depends entirely on the status of the victim. The rape of a freeborn citizen woman, especially a virgin, was a serious offense. But again, the crime was viewed primarily as a property crime against her male guardian, her father or husband. It damaged her value as a bride and dishonored her family. The perpetrator could be forced to marry her or pay a substantial fine to her male guardian. The focus was on the damage to the family's honor and finances, not necessarily on the trauma to the woman herself. When it came to the rape of a non-citizen, a slave, or a foreigner, the law was far less concerned. A slave was property. The rape of a slave was seen as damage to the owner's property, and the perpetrator would simply have to pay the owner for the damage done. The slave's own experience was legally irrelevant. This framework of taboos reveals the core of the Greek moral universe. It was not about a universal code of sexual ethics. It was about order, status, and property. The rules were not designed to protect individual souls or to enforce a divine moral law. They were designed to protect the integrity of the two most important institutions in their world, the citizen body and the oikos. Anything that threatened to pollute the citizen bloodline, dishonor a citizen's household, or disrupt the clear lines of inheritance was a grave transgression. Anything else, well, that was largely a matter of personal discretion, as long as you didn't upset the social hierarchy. The real sins in ancient Greece were not sins of the flesh, but sins against the state. Let's go back to the Symposium, but this time we're going to a very specific one. It's the most famous party in the history of philosophy, the one immortalized by Plato in his dialogue, also called the Symposium. We're here to witness a group of Athens' brightest minds try to define the true nature of love, eros. And in doing so, they will give us the concept that we, even today, refer to as platonic love. But what you'll find is that what Plato meant by it is a bit more complicated, and frankly, a lot weirder than just being friends. Imagine you are a guest, reclining on your couch. The wine has been mixed. The libations have been poured. The host decides that instead of the usual drunken revelry, each guest will give a speech in praise of the god of love. A series of speakers get up, each offering their own theory. One says love is the oldest of gods and inspires virtue. Another, the playwright Aristophanes, tells a truly bizarre and wonderful myth. He claims that humans were once round creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. They were powerful and arrogant, and they tried to climb to Olympus to attack the gods. So Zeus, to punish and weaken them, took a giant sword and sliced them all in half. Ever since, each of us is just a half person, wandering the earth, desperately searching for our other half. This, Aristophanes says, is what love is: the profound, primal yearning to find our soulmate and become whole again. He even explains different orientations this way. Some original beings were male-male, some female-female, and some male-female. It's a beautiful and surprisingly inclusive myth for its time. But then, the star of the show, Socrates, begins to speak. He says he learned everything he knows about love from a wise woman, a priestess named Diotima, and through her voice, he lays out a completely new and radical vision of what love is for. This is where we get the ladder of love, the central concept of what we call Platonism. Socrates, or rather, Diotima, says that the journey of a true lover begins with the physical. You, as a young man, are first attracted to the physical beauty of a single particular person, say, a beautiful boy. This is the first, lowest rung of the ladder. It's an important first step, but a true philosopher can't stop there. The next rung on the ladder is to realize that the beauty in this one person is not unique. It's related to the beauty in all other beautiful bodies. So you move from loving one person's body to appreciating physical beauty in general. Your love becomes less possessive and more universal. Then, you climb higher. You begin to understand that beauty of the mind and soul is far more valuable and enduring than beauty of the body. You start to fall in love with noble characters, with virtuous souls, with beautiful ideas. You would rather be with someone who is physically plain but has a brilliant, virtuous mind, than someone who is just a pretty face. This is the stage where you love laws, institutions, and the pursuit of knowledge. From there, you climb even higher, to the love of knowledge itself, philosophy. You are no longer attached to any single person or idea, but to the entire world of learning and wisdom. And finally, if you are truly dedicated, you can reach the very top of the ladder. You will be granted a sudden, breathtaking vision of the ultimate source of all beauty. This is the form of beauty itself, an eternal, unchanging, perfect, and divine concept. It is not a beautiful thing, it is beauty itself. To glimpse this, Socrates says, is the true goal of all love, and it is the only thing that can give a human life meaning. So, when we say platonic love, we usually mean a non-sexual friendship, but that's not what Plato meant. For him, the physical desire, the eros you feel for another person, is not something to be ignored or suppressed. It's the engine. It's the rocket fuel that launches you onto the first rung of the ladder. Without that initial, intense physical attraction, you can't even begin the journey. But the goal is to transcend that physical desire, to sublimate it, to use its energy to propel you upward towards a much higher, non-physical, philosophical goal. The love for the person is just the starting point for a love of pure knowledge. This is a profoundly influential idea, but historians and philosophers still debate its real-world implications. Was this ladder of love a genuine spiritual path that some Greeks tried to follow, or was it an elaborate, high-minded intellectual game? A clever way for an older philosopher like Socrates to justify his attraction to handsome young men like Alcibiades, who crashes the party, drunk, at the end of the dialogue. Some scholars argue that Plato was sincerely proposing a new kind of ascetic philosophy, one that rechannels sexual energy towards intellectual enlightenment. This idea would have a massive influence on later Christian theologians, who would adapt it into a model for loving God. Other scholars take a more cynical view. They suggest that this is Plato's attempt to rebrand the institution of paiderastia, to rescue it from its more sordid, physical realities and elevate it into something noble and pure. They argue it's a beautiful theory, but one that conveniently papers over the messy, and often unequal, nature of these relationships on the ground. It's a philosophical justification for a social practice, regardless of its practical application. The idea that Socrates' presence at that symposium is revolutionary. It transforms Eros from a dangerous, chaotic god who makes you do foolish things, into a guide, a spiritual force that can lead you from the physical world to the divine. It's an idea that would shape Western thought about love, beauty, and desire for the next around a half millennia. We've been using a lot of modern-sounding terms throughout this journey: homosexuality, bisexuality, love, romance. But it's crucial that we pause and address a major pitfall in understanding the past. The ancient Greeks did not have a concept of sexual orientation or sexual identity in the way we do today. This is one of the most important, and often difficult, distinctions to grasp. In our modern world, we tend to categorize people based on the gender of the people they are attracted to. We talk about being gay, straight, bisexual, and so on. These are identities. They describe not just who you have sex with, but who you are. It's a core part of your personality, your sense of self, and for many, their social and political identity. You, as an ancient Greek man, would find this entire concept bewildering. Your society did not categorize people this way. The critical distinction for you was not the gender of your partner, but your role in the sexual act. Were you the active, dominant, penetrating partner, or were you the passive, receptive, penetrated partner? As we've seen, for a free, adult, male citizen, the expectation was always to be the active partner, to be the eros des, the lover, not the eromenos, the beloved, to be the one who takes, not the one who is taken. As long as you maintain this dominant role, The gender of your partner, be it your wife, a male slave, a female slave, a pawnee, a hetero, or a young hero minors was of secondary social importance. A man who had sex with both men and women was not considered bisexual. He was simply considered a man with a healthy, normal libido. In fact, to engage only with men and to refuse the civic duty of marriage and procreation would be seen as strange and irresponsible. Likewise, a man who engaged only with women might be seen as perfectly normal, but not in a way that required a specific label. His behavior was simply behavior. It did not define his core identity. The only real stigma related to sexual identity was attached to the man who willingly and consistently took on the passive role. An adult man who enjoyed being penetrated was seen as unmanly and resource. He was seen as effeminate, as having the soul of a woman or a slave in the body of a citizen. The insults for such men were vicious and plentiful in Athenian comedy. He was accused of betraying his masculine nature and, by extension, his civic status. The problem was not that he desired men, but that he desired to be treated like a woman. Here's a small detail that perfectly illustrates this mindset. There is no word in classical Greek that cleanly translates to our word homosexual. The terms they used were all descriptive of roles, not identities. An Aristes was a lover of boys. Akina eidos or china edus in Latin was a derogatory term for a man who behaved in a passive, if, betum. None of these terms describe a neutral, fixed identity based on same-sex desire. The entire conceptual framework is different. This fundamental difference is a major topic of debate, pioneered by the French philosopher Michel Foucault and built upon by generations of classicists since. The central question is sexuality a biological constant throughout history, or is it a social construct that changes depending on the culture? The essentialist view would argue that people we would now call gay or straight have always existed, but different societies have either repressed them or allowed them to express their nature in different ways. In this view, an Athenian Aristes might be seen as a bisexual man, and Akina eidos might be an ancient version of a gay man, both struggling to fit their innate desires into the social roles available to them. The constructivist view, which is more widely accepted among historians today, argues that this is anachronistic. They contend that the very categories of gay and straight are modern inventions, products of 19th and 20th century medical and psychological discourse. They argue that you cannot be gay in a society that doesn't have a concept of gayness. Instead, an ancient Greek's desire was a more fluid and less categorized force, shaped and expressed through the social scripts available at the time like paiderastia, marriage, or visits to a brothel. His actions didn't define his sexuality, they affirmed his masculinity and his social status. This isn't just academic hair-splitting. It fundamentally changes how we read the past. When we look at a vase painting of two men together, our modern brain might immediately label them as a gay couple, but a historian would caution us to see them as the Greeks would have likely an Aristes and an Eromenos, participating in a specific social institution that is about education, status, and power as much as it is about desire. It forces us to shed our own assumptions and try to enter a different mental world. So, as you navigate your life in Athens, you are not worried about your sexual orientation. You are worried about your honor, your reputation, your duties as a citizen, and your role in the oikos. You are expected to desire, and to act on that desire in a variety of socially sanctioned ways. But those actions are simply things you do. They are not who you are. The very idea of a sexual identity has not yet been invented. So far, we've mostly been walking the streets of Athens, a city that prized democracy, philosophy, and the arts. But Greece was not a single, unified country. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, or polis, each with its own unique culture and laws. Now, we're going to travel to Athens' greatest rival, a place that was organized around a completely different set of principles. We are going to Sparta. If Athens was a talkative, argumentative philosopher. Sparta was a silent, disciplined soldier. Everything in Spartan society was subordinated to one goal: creating the most formidable military machine in the Greek world. This relentless focus on the state and its army dramatically reshaped the rules of love, sex, and family life, creating a system that would have seemed utterly alien to an Athenian. From the age of 7, you, as a Spartan boy, are taken from your family and enrolled in the Getty, a brutal, state-run military training program. You live in a barracks with other boys your age. Your life is one of constant hardship, discipline, and competition. You are intentionally underfed, forced to learn to steal food to survive. The crime was not stealing, but getting caught. You are taught to endure pain without complaint, to speak in short, pithy sentences, laconic, from Laconia, the region of Sparta, and to place the needs of the group and the state above all else. Your loyalty is to your messmates, not your family. In this intense, all-made environment, strong bonds were forged between the boys and their older trainers. Sound familiar? Yes. The Spartans practiced their own form of paiderastia. But unlike the Athenian version, with its emphasis on philosophy and courtship, the Spartan version was fully integrated into the military structure. A young warrior would select a boy to be his protege, responsible for his training and his moral development. The relationship was expected to be a model of military virtue. The older man was to inspire the boy to courage, and the boy was to fight bravely to bring honor to his mentor. The nature of the physical relationship in Spartan paiderastia is a hotbed of scholarly debate. The writer Xenophon, who admired the Spartans, insisted that these relationships were purely platonic and non-sexual, a model of chaste mentorship. He claimed that the Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, had outlawed physical intimacy. Other ancient sources, however, flatly contradict this, suggesting that physical relationships were a normal and expected part of the agogee. They argued it was a way to build camaraderie and fighting spirit within the ranks. This is a classic case where historians have conflicting ancient sources and have to decide which, if any, to believe. Was it a chaste ideal or a military reality? The jury is still out. Now let's look at the lives of Spartan women, which were just as radical and shocking to other Greeks. While an Athenian wife was secluded in her home, you, a Spartan woman, are raised to be a strong, healthy, and outspoken mother of warriors. You receive a formal education, run by the state. You participate in athletic competitions, running, wrestling, throwing the discus and javelin, often exercising nude or in short tunics. Just like the boys, the goal was to make your body strong and fit, not to rule, but for its uniquely Spartan purpose to produce strong and healthy Spartan babies. The state needed a steady supply of top-tier soldiers, and that started with top-tier mothers. Here's a specific detail that horrified other Greeks: the marriage customs. When you, a Spartan woman, are ready for marriage, typically at a later age than in Athens, around 18, the process is bizarre. There is a ritual abduction. Your future husband, a soldier who still lives in the barracks, will sneak into your family home at night, capture you, and take you away. You will have your hair cropped short, be dressed in men's clothes, and be left alone in a dark room. Your new husband will then sneak away from his barracks, wishing you a pleasant experience, consummate the marriage in secret and in haste, and then sneak back to sleep with his comrades before anyone notices he was gone. For the first several years of the marriage, this is how you see your husband, in short. 30. Nocturnal visits. He lives with his army unit, you live with the other women. This strange system was, according to the historian Plutarch, designed to keep the passion between the couple high and to ensure they were at their physical peak when they conceived. It was a form of state-controlled eugenics, because the men were so often absent, living in barracks until age 30 and away at war. You and the other Spartan women had an astonishing degree of freedom and economic power. You ran the estates. You managed the helots, the enslaved population. You controlled the wealth. Spartan women were famously wealthy and independent. and they were known throughout Greece for their confidence and their sharp tongues. When a foreign woman supposedly asked a Spartan queen, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who can rule men?" she famously retorted, "Because we are also the only ones who give birth to men." This entire system, with its state-run breeding programs, its separation of the sexes, and its focus on the collective over the individual oikos, creates a completely different emotional landscape. In Athens, the primary tension is between the oikos and the polis. In Sparta, the oikos is almost completely absorbed by the polis. Your marriage is not a private contract to produce an heir for your family, it is a public duty to produce a soldier for the state. Your romantic and sexual bonds, whether with your spouse or a same-sex partner, are all viewed through the lens of military utility. Does this relationship make the state stronger? If yes, it is encouraged. If no, it is irrelevant or discouraged. Sparta represents the most extreme example of how society's core values can fundamentally reshape the most personal aspects of human life. Let's travel back to Athens. And this time, we're going out for a night of entertainment. The sun is setting, and crowds are gathering on the southern slope of the Acropolis. You're heading to the Theatre of Dionysus, a vast, open-air stone amphitheatre. You're here to see a play, and while you might be familiar with the great Greek tragedies, tales of doomed kings and angry gods, tonight is a different kind of festival. It's the Lenaea, a festival famous for its comedies. And comedy, you will soon find, is where the rules of polite society are thrown out the window. As you take your seat on the hard stone bench, you are part of a massive, boisterous crowd of Athenian citizens. The atmosphere is more like a rowdy sporting event than a stuffy theatrical performance. People are eating, drinking, and shouting. The play is about to begin. The actors emerge, and you immediately know this isn't a serious drama. They are wearing grotesque masks with distorted, caricatured features. Their costumes are bizarrely padded, with huge, floppy leather phalluses attached to their tights. This is not subtle. The subject of Greek old comedy, particularly the works of its master, Aristophanes, is the city of Athens itself. The plays are a wild, surreal, and often vicious satire of Athenian politics, culture, and social life. No topic is off limits, and sex is front and center. While philosophers like Plato were busy trying to elevate eros into a divine principle, Aristophanes was dragging it right back down into the mud, and the audience loved him for it. The most famous example is his play Lysistrata. Imagine you are watching its premiere in 411 BC. The city has been embroiled in the devastating Peloponnesian War for 20 years. The mood is grim. The play's premise is brilliantly simple and absurd. The women of Greece, made by the sharp and determined Athenian Lysistrata, decide to go on a sex strike. They refuse to sleep with their husbands until the men agree to stop the war and make peace. They also seize the Acropolis, taking control of the state treasury. The result is theatrical chaos. The rest of the play is a series of hilarious scenes depicting the men of Athens growing increasingly desperate and sexually frustrated, walking around with comical, painful-looking erections represented by those large phallic props. They beg, they plead, they try to trick their wives, but the women hold firm. The play is full of explicit jokes, puns, and innuendos that would make a modern audience blush. It's a battle of the sexes fought on the most basic biological battlefield. In the end, the men's desperation is so great that they finally agree to negotiate a peace treaty. The play ends in a joyful, drunken, and very lecherous celebration. On one level, Lysistrata is a powerful anti-war statement, but it also reveals so much about Athenian attitudes towards sex and gender roles. It plays on the stereotype of men as being ruled by their uncontrollable lust, and women as being the gatekeepers of sexual access. It also, in a strange way, acknowledges female power, while women had no official political voice. The play suggests they wielded a powerful, informal influence in the domestic sphere. Here's a specific, tell in detail from the play. The oath that the women swear is not on a sacred religious subject, but on a massive bowl of wine. They pledge their allegiance to the cause not by sacrificing an animal, but by vowing not to drink any wine that has water in it, a promise to drink it neat if they break their oath, which would be a mark of total debauchery. It's a perfect comedic inversion of a solemn male ritual, showing that the women are creating their own parallel, subversive world. The existence of these plays creates a puzzle for historians, and it's a subject of ongoing debate. How could a society that, on the one hand, demanded its respectable citizen women be silent, veiled, and secluded, on the other hand, laugh opprobriously at plays that depicted women as sexually assertive, politically savvy, and vocally powerful? One theory is that the theatre was a special, carnivalesque space. It was a sanctioned safe zone where the normal rules of society could be temporarily suspended. In the context of the festival of Dionysus, the god of chaos and boundary breaking, it was okay to laugh at things that would be shocking in everyday life. The play allows for a temporary inversion of power, women taking charge, slaves outsmarting their masters precisely because everyone knows that when the play is over, the normal order will be restored. It's a way to let off social steam. Another interpretation is that these plays, while written by men and performed by male actors, even the female roles, actually reflect a deep-seated male anxiety about female power. The plays might be a way of confronting and containing those fears through laughter, by exaggerating female sexuality and power into a comedic spectacle. It perhaps made those things less threatening in the real world. Whatever the reason, the comedies of Aristophanes provide us with an invaluable, if distorted, mirror of Athenian society. They are a corrective to the high-minded texts of the philosophers and the stern pronouncements of the orators. They show us the city's underbelly, the gossip, the slang, the bodily functions, and the sexual frustrations. They remind us that the average Athenian was not a stoic philosopher warrior, but a real person who enjoyed a dirty joke as much as anyone else. As you leave the theatre, laughing along with thousands of your fellow citizens, you've experienced a different side of Athens, one that is loud, crude, and unapologetically human. Let's now turn our attention from the raucous theatre to something you might hold in your own hands, a piece of pottery. In ancient Greece, pottery was just for storing wine and olive oil. It was a canvas. The painted scenes on these vases, bowls, and drinking cups are one of our richest sources of information about Greek life, mythology, and, yes, sex. But these images come with a big warning label: what you see is not always what you get. Imagine you are at a symposium. You are drinking from a calyx, a wide, shallow drinking cup. As you lift the cup to your lips, the wine inside drains away to reveal a picture painted on the bottom, in the circular space called the toga. This little surprise image might be a mythological scene, an athletic figure, or something much more explicit. You might find a detailed depiction of a satyr chasing a nymph, or a scene from a brothel, or an intimate moment between an Aristus and his Gyromenos. These erotic scenes are incredibly valuable to historians because they show us things that the literary texts often only hint at. They provide a visual dictionary for the social and sexual practices of the time. We see the specific poses of courtship, the types of clothing worn or not worn, the furniture in the room, the musical instruments being played. It's like having a set of candid photographs from 500 years ago. For example, our understanding of the visual etiquette of paideristia, like the boy's averted gaze we discussed, comes almost entirely from these vase paintings. We can see the different types of gifts exchanged, from roosters to hares. We can see scenes of older men and youths talking in the gymnasium, the older man leaning on his staff, the youth holding an athletic implement. The vases give a visual texture to the world that words alone cannot. They also show us the more uninhibited side of Greek life. The symposium scenes are not always the high-minded philosophical debates of Plato. Many cups show the party in full swing, with guests playing cortebos, dancers performing, and sometimes guests who have had far too much to drink being sick. There are also many scenes that are explicitly pornographic, depicting a wide variety of sexual acts in frank detail. These were often painted on vessels intended for use in the Symposium. That all-male space where such imagery was considered appropriate and, perhaps even humorous entertainment. Here's a specific and fascinating category of these images: the satyrs. Satyrs, the mythical followers of Dionysus, were health-men, half-goat creatures who were the living embodiment of unrestrained male libido. On vases, they are depicted in a state of constant, comical arousal, relentlessly chasing nymphs, maenads, and generally behaving in ways that no respectable Greek citizen ever would. They are drunk, they are lecturers, and they are completely without shame. The key question historians grapple with is what these satyr scenes meant to the men drinking from the cups. Are the satyrs a representation of man's base nature, a wild and untamed part of the psyche that must be controlled in this view? Looking at a satyr is a reminder to be a good, moderate citizen and not to give in to your animal impulses. Or is it the opposite? Are the satyrs a form of wish fulfillment? A fantasy of a life without rules and consequences? Perhaps looking at the satyr was a form of escapism. A way for the buttoned-down Athenian citizen to vicariously enjoy a moment of pure, anarchic freedom in the safe space of the Symposium. This is a classic scholars are still arguing point, with good arguments on both sides. This leads to the biggest challenge with using these vase paintings as evidence. We must constantly ask, are we looking at reality or fantasy? A vase painter was not a photojournalist. He was an artist and a craftsman, creating a product for a market. He was painting what his customers wanted to see. The scenes are beautiful, athletic use and noble. Restrained Eurystie might be an idealized vision of paid Eurystia, a sort of best-case scenario that reinforced the social ideal. It doesn't mean all relationships were actually that noble. Similarly, the explicit brothel scenes might be exaggerated for comedic or titillating effect. They might be closer to modern pornography than to a documentary stylized fantasy of sexual availability, not a realistic depiction of the grim lives of poor Naii. Some scholars argue that the vases present a highly curated and sanitized view of reality, created by and for the male elite. They show the world as these men wanted it to be. For example, respectable citizen wives are almost entirely absent from these erotic scenes. Their world was private and was not meant to be depicted on a drinking cup. The women we see are mythological nymphs, hired entertainers, or sex workers, women who were available for the male gaze. Other scholars argue that while they are not literal truth, the sheer consistency of certain themes and details across thousands of vases must reflect some underlying social reality. The conventions of the averted gaze or the gift of a rooster must have been recognizable and meaningful to the original viewers. They may be idealized, but they are not pure fiction. So, as you put down your kilixen, the image at the bottom is once again covered with wine. Remember that you've just looked through a very complicated window into the past. The pottery doesn't give us a clear photograph, but something more like a dream image, a mixture of reality, idealization, and fantasy. It's up to us to try and untangle which is which. The world we've been exploring, this intricate web of Greek customs and ideas, did not exist in a vacuum. To the west, across the Ionian Sea, another power was rising, a city that began by copying the Greeks and ended by conquering them. We need to talk about the Romans. As the Roman Republic grew and eventually swallowed up the Greek world in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, they were faced with a culture they both admired and were deeply suspicious of. The Romans were obsessed with Greek art, literature, and philosophy. Wealthy Romans hired Greek tutors for their sons, filled their villas with Greek statues, and read great texts. But when it came to Greek sexual customs, they had a very different, and much more judgmental, perspective. Imagine you are a traditional, conservative Roman senator. You see Greek culture as sophisticated, yes, but also as dangerously soft and decadent. The Greek practice of exercising nude in the gymnasium to you, this is a source of national shame, an invitation to effeminacy and moral corruption. Discipline, fully clothed soldier farmer. Public nudity was seen as disgraceful. And the Greek institution of paiderastia, this was particularly problematic for the Roman mindset. While relationships between masters and their young male slaves were common and unremarkable in Rome, it was all about power, not gender. The idea of a relationship between a citizen man and a freeborn citizen boy was deeply suspect. The Romans had a law, the lex continui, which, though its details are murky, seems to have been used to prosecute Roman citizens who took the passive role in a same-sex encounter, and perhaps even to punish the seduction of freeborn youths. For you, the Roman patriarch, the primary virtue was gravitas, a sense of seriousness, duty, and self-control. The Greek model of an older man openly courting a boy, writing him poetry, and sighing over his beauty at the Symposium seemed frivolous and undignified. It lacked the seriousness that a Roman man was supposed to embody. A Roman man's desire was supposed to be channeled in one of two acceptable directions towards his wife for the purpose of producing heirs, or toward a non-citizen, a slave, a prostitute for simple physical release. The passion was to be kept private, the public face was one of stoic control. However, as Rome became more powerful and absorbed more Greek influence, a fascinating cultural shift occurred. The Roman elite began to adopt and adapt Greek customs, but they gave them a distinctly Roman twist. They fell in love with the idea of Greece, but they were selective about what they took. Here's a specific example: the adoption of boy love. While the classic Greek model of mentoring a freeborn youth never really took hold in Rome, a new fashion emerged among the ultra-wealthy elite. They began to acquire beautiful, educated, and highly accomplished young male slaves, often from the Greek-speaking East. These boys, known as pueri delicati delicate boys, were kept as pampered pets and status symbols. They were trained in music and literature and served as conversation partners and bedmates for their masters. This is a subtle but crucial transformation of the Greek ideal. The Roman version stripped away the pretense of education and civic virtue. The relationship was not about mentoring a future citizen, it was about the naked expression of a master's power and wealth. The boy was not a freeborn minus with his own honor to protect, he was property, an object of luxury, like a fine vase or a purebred horse. The power dynamic, already present in the Greek model, became absolute and undisguised in the Roman one. The Emperor Hadrian's famous love for the beautiful Greek youth Antinous is the most famous example of this phenomenon. But it was a practice found throughout the upper echelons of Roman society. The Roman view of female sexuality was also different. While the basic structure of a patriarchal marriage for procreation was similar, the Romans placed an even stronger emphasis on female chastity and fidelity, embodied in the ideal of the matrone, the dignified and loyal Roman wife. The figure of the witty, independent hetaera didn't have a direct equivalent in Roman society. While they were high-class courtesans, they never achieved the same kind of intellectual celebrity status as an Aspasia. Roman morality was, on the surface at least, more rigid and less tolerant of female independence. This brings us to a historical debate: did the Romans corrupt Greek ideals? Or did they simply strip away the hypocrisy and reveal the power dynamics that were there all along? Some historians argue that the Romans, with their pragmatic and less philosophical mindset, simply did away with the pretty lies the Greeks told themselves. They saw the power and desire at the core of paiderastia and institutionalized it in the form of slave ownership, without all the philosophical hand-wringing about virtue and education. In this view, the Roman practice is simply a more honest, if more brutal, version of the Greek one. Other scholars contend that this is unfair to the Greeks. They argue that the educational and civic ideals of the Greek model, even if not always perfectly realized, were genuinely important and made the institution fundamentally different from the master-slave dynamic of the Romans. They see the Roman adaptation as a coarsening, a loss of the philosophical and romantic subtlety that characterized the Greek original. What's clear is that as the Roman eagle replaced the Athenian owl as the dominant symbol of power in the Mediterranean, the cultural conversation around sex and relationships began to change. The focus shifted from the Greek concerns of education and idealized beauty to the Roman concerns of power, property, and public dignity. This Roman interpretation of Greek customs would become the dominant one for centuries, a bridge carrying a modified, and some would say distorted, version of classical sexuality into the late antique world. The world we have been exploring, this classical world of symposia, gymnasia, and Olympian gods could not last forever. Like a long, boisterous party, the evening eventually had to come to an end. The decline was slow, happening over centuries, but as the Roman Empire raged, a series of profound shifts began to chip away at the very foundations of the Greek and Roman worldview on love, sex, and the body. You can feel the change in the air. The old gods, the chaotic, passionate, all-too-human deities of Olympus, are starting to seem less like powerful forces and more like characters in old stories. The confidence and civic pride that characterized classical Athens have given way to a more uncertain and cosmopolitan world under the vast, bureaucratic Roman Empire. New ideas are flowing in from the East, new philosophies, and, most importantly, new religions. One of the most powerful shifts comes from philosophy itself. Thinkers known as the Stoics, who became very popular in the Roman era, began to preach a new kind of morality. For them, the goal of life was to live in accordance with nature and reason, free from the grip of passion. They saw desire, eros, not as a creative or educational force in the Platonic sense, but as a dangerous, irrational impulse that threatened one's inner peace. A wise man, a Stoic sage, was a master of his own desires. This led to a more restrained and ascetic view of sex. Sex was for procreation within marriage, and that was it. To engage in it for mere pleasure was to give into an irrational passion, to lose your self-control. This is a far cry from the Greek citizen's unapologetic pursuit of pleasure. At the same time, new mystery cults and religions from Persia, Egypt, and Judea are gaining traction across the empire. Many of these faiths offered something the old state religions did not: a personal relationship with a savior deity, a strong moral code, and the promise of a blessed afterlife. And one of these, a small Jewish sect that followed a crucified Messiah, began to spread with an astonishing speed. Its name was Christianity. The rise of Christianity would deliver the final, decisive blow to the classical sexual ethos. The early Christian fathers looked at the Greco-Roman world and were appalled by what they saw: the nudity of the gymnasium, the institution of paiderastia, the brothels, the erotic art to them. This was not a world of civilized freedom, but one of rampant sin and moral decay. Christianity introduced a radically new set of ideas about the body and sexuality. The body was not something to be celebrated and perfected in the gymnasium, it was a source of temptation, a vessel of sin that was at war with the spirit. Virginity, which in the classical world was simply a temporary state for a girl before marriage, was elevated into a supreme spiritual ideal, a state of holiness for both men and women. The Apostle Paul, in his letters, famously stated that it is better to marry than to burn with passion, framing marriage not as a civic duty for the oikos, but as a reluctant concession for those who lack the spiritual strength for celibacy. Here's a small but profound detail that shows the changing worldview. Remember how the Greeks saw a strong libido as a sign of masculine vigor? The early Christian saints flipped this completely. The great heroes of their stories, the desert fathers, were men who went out into the wilderness to prove their holiness by conquering their libido. They would fast, pray, and fight epic battles against demonic visions of beautiful women. Their strength was measured not by their sexual potency, but by their ability to extinguish it entirely. This is a complete reversal of the classical ideal. This new morality, with its emphasis on sin, chastity, and the afterlife, slowly but surely replaced the old one. The laws of the now Christian Roman Empire began to reflect this. The old, tolerated practices were outlawed. Brothels were shut down. The temples to the old gods were closed or converted into churches. The Olympic Games, with their pagan rituals and naked athletes, were banned in 393 AD by the Emperor Theodosius I. The classical world was officially over. There's a long-running historical debate about this transition. Was the rise of Christian sexual morality a positive development that reigned in the excesses and brutalities of the pagan world, like infant exposure and the exploitation of slaves, or was it a repressive, anti-body, anti-pleasure ideology that cast a long, dark shadow of guilt and shame over Western civilization for centuries to come? The long-declined narrative, famously articulated by Edward Gibbon, saw the rise of Christianity as a triumph of barbarism and religion that destroyed the glories of classical civilization. This view sees the new morality as a step backward, a loss of freedom and rationalism. More recently, historians have offered a more nuanced picture. They argue that the classical world was far from perfect, and that for many people, slaves, women, the poor, the new Christian ethics, with its emphasis on charity and the equality of all souls before God, may have offered a new sense of dignity and hope. They also point out that the change was not a simple replacement, but a complex fusion. Christian theology was deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism and Stoicism. They didn't just destroy the old world, they absorbed and transformed it. As the last fires on the altars of Zeus and Aphrodite flicker out, a new moral universe is dawning. The questions are no longer about honor and shame, but about sin and salvation. The focus is no longer on your duties to the polis in this life, but on the state of your soul for the next. The conversation about what it means to love and desire has been irrevocably changed, and the world you knew has slowly, quietly, faded into history. And so, the journey through that ancient, sun-drenched, and complicated world comes to a close. The voices from the Symposium grow quiet, the dust settles on the gymnasium, and the old stories are folded away like treasured, fragile scrolls. The world kept turning, as it always does, carrying new ideas, new beliefs, and new ways of understanding the human heart, leaving that classical world to become a distant memory, a whisper in the long corridor of time. You can feel the edges of this story beginning to blur now, softening as you drift deeper. The sharp details of Athens and Sparta, of gods and mortals, begin to dissolve into the gentle, abstract patterns of a dream. The weight of history lifts, leaving only a quiet sense of distance, a peaceful awareness of the endless flow of time. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing to question. The journey is over. The only thing left to do is to let go, to allow the gentle current to carry you away from the shores of wakefulness and out into the calm, quiet sea of sleep. Let your thoughts drift. Let your breathing be slow and deep. You are safe. You are comfortable. And you are ready for rest. The end of the article. Good night.